When darkness learns to walk upright and wear a human face, it doesn't announce itself with thunder. It whispers through apartment hallways, turning ordinary moments into final breaths. Welcome to True Crime Headquarters, where every story runs darker than the last, and the truth is always colder than fiction. I'm truly glad you're here. Whether you're watching from New York, South Africa, Canada, the Philippines, the UK, Greece, Sweden, New Zealand, or any of the countless places I can't name one by one, know this: I see you, I appreciate you, and you're part of this growing family. These stories are crafted to reach those who crave truth in the quiet hours. People who unwind, think, and fall asleep with mystery lingering in their minds. But when you only watch without subscribing, liking, or commenting, these stories don't travel far. They stay hidden when they should be heard. It costs nothing to hit subscribe, drop a like, or leave a thought below. But that small action keeps this channel alive and lets me keep sharing the dark, the true, and the untold. So, if these stories speak to you, please take a moment. It means everything, and it helps keep the truth alive. So, have you subscribed yet? I'm waiting. Done? Great. Thank you. I want you to know that every click and comment counts, and you are very important and highly welcome to air. This is the story of the Blood Merchant of Boston. A single scream cuts through the February cold of Boston's South End. Sharp, desperate, then suddenly silenced. By the time neighbors peer through their peepholes, the only sound remaining is the steady drip of something wet hitting hardwood floors. Inside apartment 4C, Cordell Farrington stands over his latest victim, hands still trembling with adrenaline, watching the life fade from eyes that moments ago held hope for tomorrow. This isn't his first kill. It won't be his last. What transforms an ordinary man into a methodical killer who turns human beings into broken, bloodied puzzles? How does someone move through society undetected while leaving a trail of shattered lives and grieving families? This is the story of Cordell Farrington, a predator who discovered that the distance between civilized man and savage monster is nothing more than a single, irreversible choice. Before the courts would finally stop him, before the families would bury their loved ones, before the city of Boston would learn to fear the shadows in their own neighborhoods, Farrington would paint the streets red with a brutality so calculated, so vicious, that seasoned homicide detectives would struggle to sleep at night. His victims never saw him coming. They never understood why. And in those final, terrifying moments when realization dawned, it was already far too late. I know you love falling asleep to these stories, and tonight you're in for something truly chilling. We'll be exploring 4 haunting true crime cases, each one darker than the last. So, get cozy, unwind, and let the day melt away. But before you drift off, please don't forget to like, subscribe, share, and comment, and tell us where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. Now, close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let's begin. Cordell Farrington didn't become a killer overnight. Monsters rarely do. They evolve slowly, shaped by circumstances, choices, and the gradual erosion of whatever humanity once anchored them to decency. Born in the winter of 1963 in the hardscrabble neighborhoods of Roxbury, Massachusetts, Farrington entered a world already steeped in violence, poverty, and the kind of desperation that turns good people into ghosts and vulnerable people into victims. His childhood home was a cramped 3-room apartment where the walls were thin enough to hear every argument, every slap, every sob that echoed through the night. His father, a man whose hands knew only 2 languages, hard work and harder violence, ruled the household with an iron fist wrapped in alcoholic fury. Young Cordell learned early that the world was divided into 2 categories: predators and prey. There was no middle ground, no safety in weakness, no mercy for those who couldn't defend themselves. By age 7, Cordell had witnessed his father beat his mother unconscious 3 times. By age 9, he'd learned to hide in closets, pressing his small hands against his ears, trying to block out the sounds of bones meeting flesh, of furniture splintering, of his mother's pleading voice growing weaker with each passing year. By age 12, he'd stopped trying to intervene, stopped crying, stopped feeling much of anything at all. The emotional calluses had formed, thick and impenetrable, transforming the frightened boy into something harder, colder, more dangerous. School offered no refuge. Cordell was neither popular nor particularly intelligent, existing in that invisible space occupied by children who've learned that drawing attention means inviting pain. Teachers barely noticed him. Classmates forgot his name. He moved through the hallways like smoke, present but insubstantial, already practicing the art of invisibility that would later serve him so well. But Cordell was watching, always watching. He observed how power dynamics played out in the schoolyard, how the strong dominated the weak, how fear could be weaponized, manipulated, used to control others. He studied the bullies who terrorized smaller kids, noting their techniques, their patterns, the psychological warfare they employed to break spirits before ever landing a punch. He wasn't learning empathy or compassion. He was learning methodology. The first time Cordell hurt someone deliberately, he was 14 years old. A neighborhood cat, orange and friendly, had made the fatal mistake of trusting him. What happened in the basement of that Roxbury apartment building over the course of 3 hours would set a template for horrors to come. The cat's screams went unheard, its suffering unwitnessed. When Cordell finally emerged, something fundamental had shifted inside him. He discovered a terrible truth. He enjoyed it. The power, the control, the absolute dominion over another living thing's existence. It filled a void he hadn't even known existed. Animals became his testing ground. Over the next 4 years, neighborhood pets began disappearing with alarming regularity. Dogs found dead in alleyways, their bodies bearing signs of prolonged torture. Birds discovered with wings methodically broken, left to suffer before death offered mercy. Small creatures who'd committed no sin beyond crossing Cordell Farrington's path and becoming objects of his growing fascination with inflicting pain. Nobody connected the dots. Nobody suspected the quiet teenager who kept to himself, who never caused trouble in public, who seemed utterly unremarkable in every measurable way. This was Cordell's greatest talent. The ability to hide in plain sight, to present a face to the world that revealed nothing of the darkness churning inside. By 18, Cordell had dropped out of school and drifted through a series of minimum-wage jobs, warehouse work, janitorial services, overnight security positions that kept him isolated from meaningful human contact. He preferred it that way. People complicated things. People asked questions, formed attachments, expected reciprocity in relationships. Cordell had no interest in the give and take of normal human interaction. He wanted only to take. His first adult relationship was with a woman named Michelle, a fragile 20-year-old nursing student who mistook his silence for depth and his emotional unavailability for mysterious complexity. She believed she could fix him, heal whatever wounds he carried from childhood, love him into becoming the man she imagined he could be. It was a fatal miscalculation. The relationship lasted 7 months. During that time, Michelle endured psychological abuse so systematic and devastating that friends barely recognized her by the end. Cordell was methodical in his destruction of her spirit, isolating her from support systems, undermining her confidence, gaslighting her into questioning her own reality. When she finally found the courage to leave, Cordell showed no emotion whatsoever. He simply moved on to the next victim, having perfected his techniques, having learned what worked and what didn't. But psychological torment wasn't enough anymore. The urges were growing stronger, more specific, more violent. Cordell found himself fantasizing about crossing that final line, about transforming fantasy into blood-soaked reality. He knew it was only a matter of time, only a question of opportunity and victim selection. The hunter was ready. He just needed to find the right prey. Boston in the late 1980s was a city in transition. The combat zone, Boston's red light district, was slowly being cleaned up, pushing sex workers, addicts, and the desperately poor into other neighborhoods. These were people society had already abandoned, people whose disappearances might not trigger intensive investigations, people vulnerable and accessible. For someone like Cordell Farrington, it was a hunting ground rich with potential victims. He began frequenting areas where desperation gathered like fog. Homeless shelters, methadone clinics, street corners where women sold their bodies for drug money or simple survival. He watched, learned patterns, identified individuals whose absence might go unnoticed or unmourned. Cordell was patient. He understood that successful predation required planning, preparation, the careful selection of victims who existed on society's margins. His apartment in the South End was perfect for his purposes. Ground floor, accessible through both front and back entrances, located in a building where neighbors minded their own business and loud noises were common enough to raise no alarms. Cordell soundproofed one room with cheap foam panels and heavy blankets, creating a space where screams would die against fabric walls, where whatever happened inside would remain secret. He purchased tools, duct tape, rope, plastic sheeting, knives of various sizes, a baseball bat, cleaning supplies designed to eliminate biological evidence. Each acquisition was made separately at different stores, paid for in cash, leaving no paper trail connecting the purchases to a single individual preparing for murder. Cordell was thorough. He'd spent years thinking about this, years preparing, and he wasn't going to be caught due to careless mistakes. The final piece was psychological preparation. Cordell spent hours visualizing the act itself, selecting a victim, luring them to his apartment, overpowering them, and then taking his time doing whatever dark impulses demanded. He desensitized himself to what he was about to do, framing it not as murder but as claiming what was rightfully his, absolute power over another human being's existence. On March 15, 1989, Cordell Farrington was ready. The monster had been built brick by brick, trauma by trauma, choice by choice. What remained was the transformation from fantasy to reality, from would-be killer to actual murderer. The streets of Boston held thousands of potential victims, and Cordell Farrington was about to teach the city a terrible lesson about the evil that walks among us, wearing ordinary faces and harboring extraordinary darkness. Night fell over the South End, and Cordell stepped out into the cold March air, adrenaline singing through his veins, hands steady with purpose. Somewhere out there was his first victim, a human being who would be reduced to a crime scene photograph, a case file number, a name on a growing list of the dead. The hunt had begun, and Boston would never be quite the same. Her name was Denise Matthews, though most people on the street knew her simply as Dee. 26 years old, heroin addict, occasionally homeless, estranged from a family that had long since given up trying to save her from herself. She existed in that twilight world of the desperately addicted, cycling between brief moments of clarity and long stretches where the only thing that mattered was the next fix, the next chemical escape from a reality too painful to endure sober. Cordell spotted her just after midnight on a Tuesday, standing outside a closed convenience store on Massachusetts Avenue, shivering despite the heavy jacket wrapped around her thin frame. She looked vulnerable, desperate, exactly the kind of person who might accept a stranger's offer of warmth, food, and a place to get off the street for a few hours. He approached slowly, keeping his body language non-threatening, his face arranged in an expression of concern rather than predatory interest. The conversation was brief. Cordell offered her $40 and a warm meal, no strings attached, claiming he'd recently been homeless himself and wanted to help someone in similar circumstances. The lie came easily, smoothly, wrapped in enough authentic-sounding detail to bypass Denise's drug-dulled instincts for self-preservation. She hesitated only briefly before accepting, desperation overriding the small voice in her head that whispered warnings she couldn't quite articulate. The walk to Cordell's apartment took 12 minutes. They passed 3 people who would later tell police they'd seen the pair walking together. The woman seeming relaxed, laughing at something the man said, showing no signs of distress or coercion. How could they have known they were witnessing someone's final moments of freedom? The last time Denise Matthews would walk under open sky, breathe cold night air, exist as anything other than a victim. The apartment was warm as promised. Cordell directed her to the kitchen table, offered her a sandwich and coffee, played the role of Good Samaritan with Oscar-worthy conviction. Denise relaxed further, the tension bleeding from her shoulders as warmth seeped into her chronically cold bones. She talked about her life, the daughter she'd lost custody of 3 years prior, the parents who wouldn't return her calls, the dreams she'd once harbored before heroin turned them to ashes. Cordell listened, nodded in appropriate places, and felt absolutely nothing. The drug he'd slipped into her coffee worked quickly. Rohypnol, the date rape drug, combined with her existing exhaustion and malnutrition to render her unconscious within 15 minutes. Cordell watched her eyes glaze, her speech slur, her body sag forward as consciousness fled. He caught her before she could fall from the chair, her dead weight pressing against him as he maneuvered her toward the soundproofed room he'd prepared. When Denise regained consciousness, the world had transformed into nightmare. She was bound to a chair with duct tape, her wrists secured behind her back, ankles taped to the chair legs, another strip across her mouth muffling the scream that erupted when awareness returned. The room was dim, lit only by a single bare bulb dangling from the ceiling, casting harsh shadows that made everything appear distorted, surreal. Cordell sat across from her, watching her panic with clinical interest, studying the way terror manifested in dilated pupils, in the frantic rise and fall of her chest, in the desperate thrashing that accomplished nothing except exhausting her further. He let her struggle for several minutes before speaking, his voice calm, almost friendly, as if they were simply continuing their earlier conversation. What followed over the next 6 hours would haunt the homicide detectives who eventually processed the scene. Cordell took his time, savoring each moment, experimenting with different forms of pain to catalog her responses. He started with psychological torment, explaining exactly what he planned to do, describing in meticulous detail the suffering she would endure, letting her imagination amplify the terror. Denise thrashed against her restraints until her wrists bled, screaming against the tape until her throat was raw, begging with her eyes for mercy that would never arrive. The physical torture began slowly. Cordell used cigarettes first, pressing the burning tips against her arms, her neck, her face, watching the skin blister and char, inhaling the acrid smell of burning flesh. Denise's muffled screams were music to something broken inside him, each cry of agony feeding a hunger that only grew stronger with satisfaction. He moved methodically, almost scientifically, testing how much pain different areas of the body could tolerate, learning the geography of human suffering. He progressed to the knife, a 7-inch hunting blade he'd sharpened to razor precision. The cuts started shallow, thin lines across her forearms that welled with blood but weren't immediately life-threatening. Cordell was learning, discovering what angles produced maximum pain with minimum lethality. He wanted to prolong this, to stretch the experience across as many hours as possible before the inevitable conclusion. Denise lost consciousness multiple times, her body shutting down to escape trauma too overwhelming to process. Each time, Cordell revived her, smelling salts, ice water, calculated violence that shocked her system back to awareness. He wanted her present, wanted her to experience every moment of her destruction, wanted the full measure of her suffering. Unconsciousness was escape, and Cordell wasn't ready to grant escape. Around 4 in the morning, Cordell escalated. The baseball bat came out, and the nature of the violence shifted from cutting to crushing. The first blow shattered Denise's left kneecap, the sound like a branch snapping, her scream so intense it tore through the tape covering her mouth. Cordell paused, considered, then systematically worked his way up her body, knees, thighs, ribs, shoulders, each impact producing new symphonies of agony, new levels of devastation. By the time dawn light began filtering through the covered windows, Denise Matthews was barely recognizable as human. Her body was a canvas of burns, cuts, bruises, and broken bones. Blood pooled beneath the chair, soaked into the plastic sheeting Cordell had laid down, turned the air thick with copper tang. She was still breathing, somehow, clinging to life with the desperate tenacity of organisms programmed for survival even when survival meant only prolonged suffering. Cordell felt satiated, complete in a way he'd never experienced before. The fantasy that had consumed him for years had been realized, exceeded, proven more intoxicating than imagination could capture. But dawn was approaching, and practical considerations reasserted themselves. It was time to finish this, to transform victim into corpse, to begin the cleanup that would eliminate evidence of what had occurred in the soundproofed room. The final act was almost anticlimactic. Cordell wrapped his hands around Denise's throat and squeezed, watching the last light fade from eyes that had already seen too much horror to process. Her body convulsed weakly, a dying animal's final protest against inevitable darkness. Then stillness. Then nothing. Denise Matthews, daughter, addict, human being with dreams and regrets, and a soul that had deserved so much better than this ending, was gone. Cordell sat back, breathing heavily, his clothes soaked with blood and sweat, his mind already turning to logistics. The body needed disposal. The room required thorough cleaning. Evidence had to be eliminated. But underlying the practical considerations was a terrible truth. He'd loved every moment of it. The power, the control, the absolute dominion over another person's life and death. It was everything he'd imagined and more. This wouldn't be the last time. Couldn't be the last time. The hunger was already returning, the satisfaction of one kill creating appetite for the next. Cordell Farrington had crossed the final barrier between civilized human and remorseless predator, and there was no path back to who he'd been before. The monster was fully born, baptized in blood and screaming, and Boston was about to learn what it meant to have a serial killer in its midst. The cleanup took most of the day. Cordell worked methodically, breaking down the body into manageable pieces, sealing them in contractor bags he'd purchased weeks earlier from multiple different stores. The plastic sheeting was burned in a drum behind the building, the ashes scattered. The room was scrubbed with bleach, every surface sanitized multiple times, every trace of biological evidence eliminated or rendered useless for forensic analysis. By nightfall, Denise Matthews had been reduced to garbage bags in Cordell's trunk, her existence erased from his apartment, her suffering converted into memory and darkening stains that would never quite disappear no matter how much bleach he applied. Cordell drove to a construction site in Dorchester, one of dozens scattered throughout the city, and deposited the bags in a dumpster scheduled for pickup the next morning. The body parts would be hauled to a landfill, buried under tons of refuse, lost forever in the city's accumulated waste. Denise Matthews would be reported missing 3 days later by a shelter worker who knew her. The report would be filed alongside hundreds of others. Missing addicts, homeless individuals, vulnerable people who disappeared regularly from Boston's streets. No intensive investigation was launched. No media coverage highlighted her disappearance. Society had already written her off, had already decided her life wasn't worth the resources required for serious investigation. Cordell knew this, had counted on it, had chosen his first victim precisely because her disappearance would generate minimal official response. He was learning, adapting, perfecting his craft. The first kill had been clumsy in some ways, overly elaborate in others, but successful in the only metric that mattered. He'd gotten away with it. The hunger returned within 2 weeks, stronger than before, impossible to ignore or satisfy with anything other than blood. Over the next 33 months, Cordell Farrington would claim at least 11 more lives. At least, investigators would later suspect the actual number was higher, perhaps significantly higher, but could only definitively connect him to 12 victims through physical evidence or confession. The true body count remains unknown, buried with secrets Cordell took to prison, concealed in landfills and construction sites, dissolved in chemicals or burned beyond recognition. Each killing built upon lessons learned from previous murders. Cordell refined his technique, developed patterns, created a methodology that maximized his satisfaction while minimizing risk of capture. He was evolving into something terrifyingly efficient. A predator who understood his hunting ground, who could identify vulnerable prey with practiced ease, who left minimal forensic evidence and selected victims whose disappearances raised few alarms. His second victim was Marcus Thompson, a 31-year-old homeless military veteran suffering from untreated PTSD and substance abuse issues. Cordell encountered him sleeping in a doorway during the early hours of a cold April morning. The approach was similar to before, offer of warmth, food, temporary shelter from the harsh streets. Marcus, desperate and exhausted, accepted without significant hesitation. But Cordell had learned from Denise. This time, he drugged Marcus before they even reached the apartment, slipping sedatives into coffee purchased at a 24-hour diner. By the time they arrived at Cordell's place, Marcus was already fading, his resistance minimal when Cordell secured him in the prepared room. The kill took longer than the first, nearly 9 hours of sustained torture, but was ultimately more satisfying because Cordell had maintained better control throughout, pacing himself, exploring new forms of brutality. Marcus's military training proved both challenge and entertainment. Even drugged and restrained, he fought harder than Denise had, his combat instincts surfacing despite overwhelming odds. Cordell relished this resistance, found greater satisfaction in breaking someone with fighting spirit than in dominating someone already defeated by life. The psychological warfare intensified. Cordell researched PTSD triggers and deliberately deployed them, weaponizing Marcus's trauma against him, turning his mind into an additional torture device. The knife work was more sophisticated this time. Cordell had been practicing on meat from butcher shops, learning anatomy, understanding which cuts caused maximum pain while preserving life longest. He applied this knowledge to Marcus's living body, creating wounds calibrated to maximize suffering without causing rapid death from blood loss. It was artistry of the most horrific kind, precision employed in service of cruelty. Marcus Thompson's final hours were spent in agony beyond human capacity to articulate. Cordell broke his fingers one by one, shattered his teeth with pliers, carved designs into his chest and abdomen, and finally, when dawn approached and practical considerations reasserted themselves, strangled him with the same methodical patience he'd employed throughout the torture. Marcus's body was disposed of similarly to Denise's, deposited in another construction site dumpster, buried under the city's endless accumulation of waste. The pattern was established. Every 2 to 3 months, Cordell would hunt. The victims were always vulnerable. Homeless individuals, addicts, sex workers, people existing on society's margins whose absence might go unnoticed or under-investigated. He varied his hunting grounds, moving between different Boston neighborhoods, never establishing predictable patterns that might alert authorities to a serial predator operating in the city. Victim 3 was Angela Rodriguez, a 29-year-old sex worker supporting a heroin addiction. Cordell picked her up in the combat zone, paid for her services, and drove her to his apartment where the familiar nightmare began. Angela suffered for 7 hours before death finally arrived as mercy. Her screams were absorbed by soundproofed walls, her suffering witnessed only by a man incapable of empathy or remorse. Victim 4 was James Patterson, a 53-year-old alcoholic sleeping rough in a South End alley. The torture lasted 10 hours. James begged for death long before it came, his pleas ignored by a killer whose capacity for cruelty seemed bottomless. Victim 5 was Keisha Williams, a 22-year-old crack addict estranged from her family. 8 hours of sustained brutality before strangulation ended her suffering. The kills blurred together, distinguished only by individual variations in victim response to torture, in how long each person survived before shock and trauma shut down biological systems. Cordell kept no trophies, too risky, too likely to provide evidence if police ever searched his apartment. The memories were trophy enough, replayed endlessly in the privacy of his mind. Each remembered scream and plea and moment of absolute power over another human's existence, feeding the hunger that never fully subsided. By late 1990, Cordell had perfected his craft. He could identify vulnerable targets with almost supernatural accuracy, could manipulate them into trusting him within minutes, could torture them for hours while maintaining their consciousness through increasingly sophisticated techniques, and could dispose of bodies so thoroughly that most victims were never found. He'd become the nightmare that walks upright, the monster disguised as unremarkable man. The predator society never quite sees until it's far too late. The tools in his killing room expanded: power tools for producing specific types of wounds, chemicals for intensifying pain without causing unconsciousness, medical equipment stolen from hospital dumpsters that allowed him to monitor vital signs and keep victims alive longer than their bodies naturally wanted to survive. Cordell approached murder the way others approach hobbies, with dedication to continuous improvement and mastery of technique. Victims 6 through 12 followed the established pattern, each one a variation on themes of capture, torture, and disposal. Their names: Robert Chen, 41, homeless; Maria Sanchez, 34, sex worker; Devin Walker, 27, drug addict; Christine O'Brien, 39, chronically homeless with mental illness; Tyrone Mitchell, 25, military veteran with addiction issues; Sandra Phillips, 47, longtime homeless resident of Boston Common, and Thomas Riley, 36, alcoholic estranged from his family. Each person had a story, a history, relationships, however strained, that connected them to the broader human community. Each had been someone's child, had experienced moments of joy and connection and hope before circumstances and choices led them to the streets where Cordell Farrington hunted. Each deserved better than the fate that found them in a soundproofed room, at the mercy of a man who had long since abandoned mercy. The brutality Cordell inflicted defied description. Investigators who eventually processed crime scenes and reviewed evidence would require counseling to process what they'd witnessed. The sheer creativity of cruelty on display suggested a mind so divorced from normal human psychology that rehabilitation seemed impossible. Cordell didn't just kill. He destroyed, degraded, reduced human beings to broken meat and terror, and did so with evident satisfaction that chilled even hardened homicide detectives. Some victims endured cigarette burns covering 80% of their bodies. Others suffered systematic bone breaking that left skeletons shattered in dozens of places. Several experienced torture with corrosive chemicals that ate through flesh, producing pain so intense that rational thought became impossible. All of them screamed themselves hoarse, begged until their voices failed, experienced such profound suffering that death arrived as mercy rather than tragedy. Cordell documented nothing, left no written records of his kills, maintained no journals or photographs. The documentation existed only in his memory, replayed endlessly during the weeks between murders, sustaining him until the hunger grew too strong to resist and he ventured out to hunt again. This discipline, refusing to create physical evidence of his crimes, would prove crucial to avoiding capture for as long as he did. But even the most careful predator eventually makes mistakes. Even the most disciplined killer eventually leaves evidence that sharp-eyed investigators can follow back to its source. For Cordell Farrington, that mistake came in the form of Victim 13, a woman who would survive long enough to identify her attacker, and whose survival would finally expose the monster to the light. Lisa Chun was different from Cordell's usual victims. 28 years old, she worked as a nursing assistant at Boston City Hospital, was enrolled part-time in a community college pursuing her RN degree, and maintained close relationships with family and friends. She wasn't homeless, wasn't an addict, wasn't someone whose disappearance would go unnoticed or under-investigated. Her presence on Cordell's radar was accidental, a case of wrong place and terrible timing that would ultimately prove fatal to his freedom. The encounter happened on December 3, 1991, outside a laundromat in the South End where Lisa was finishing her weekly washing. Her car had broken down that morning, forcing her to take public transportation and walk the final 6 blocks to her apartment carrying heavy bags of clean clothes. It was after midnight, the streets mostly empty, the temperature dropping toward freezing. She was exhausted from a double shift at the hospital, her guard lowered by fatigue and the mundane nature of the task she'd just completed. Cordell saw opportunity. He approached, offering help with her bags, playing the role of helpful neighbor, his face arranged in friendly concern. Lisa hesitated. Her instincts were better calibrated than previous victims, but ultimately accepted assistance. She was tired, the bags were heavy, and he seemed harmless enough. They walked together toward her apartment building, making small talk, Lisa mentally cataloging details about her helper in case she needed to identify him later, a cautious woman's automatic threat assessment. They were 2 blocks from Lisa's apartment when Cordell made his move. The knife appeared from inside his jacket, pressed against her ribs before she could process what was happening. His voice, previously friendly, turned cold and commanding. Cooperate or die here on the street, choice was hers. Lisa, trained in medical trauma response, understood immediately that compliance offered better survival odds than resistance. She went with him quietly, already thinking ahead to escape opportunities, to ways she might survive what was coming. The walk to Cordell's apartment took 15 minutes this time. He was being extra cautious, avoiding main streets, keeping Lisa close and the knife concealed but pressed against her body as constant reminder of the threat. They passed fewer potential witnesses at this late hour. The streets surrendered to predators and prey, to people with nowhere else to be and reasons for avoiding daylight scrutiny. Inside his apartment, the familiar nightmare began. But Lisa was different. Her medical training kicked in even as terror threatened to overwhelm rational thought. She observed everything: room layout, potential weapons, the soundproofing that explained why no one heard previous victims scream. She talked to Cordell constantly, trying to establish human connection, deploying every psychology trick she could remember from crisis intervention training. She needed him to see her as person rather than object, to hesitate long enough for opportunity to emerge. Cordell drugged her coffee as usual, but Lisa only pretended to drink, palming the rohypnol-laced liquid when he turned away, pouring it into a potted plant. When he expected her to fade into unconsciousness, she feigned the symptoms, letting her eyes glaze, her speech slur, her body sag convincingly. Cordell, overconfident from dozens of successful kills, didn't scrutinize closely enough to catch the deception. He carried her to the prepared room, bound her to the familiar chair, and left briefly to gather his tools. This was Lisa's moment. Fully conscious, adrenaline burning through her system, she worked frantically at the duct tape binding her wrists. Medical training had taught her anatomy, including how joints and tendons moved, how to create slack in restraints by positioning hands strategically. The tape tore skin as she worked, blood making her wrists slippery, but pain was irrelevant compared to the alternative. One hand came free just as Cordell returned. Lisa exploded into action, ripping the tape from her mouth, screaming with every ounce of air in her lungs. Not muffled cries absorbed by soundproofing, but full-throated shrieks of fire repeated over and over. She'd learned in self-defense classes that people ignore cries for help but respond to fire, and she needed witnesses, needed police, needed intervention before Cordell could silence her permanently. Cordell rushed her, knife raised, rage transforming his face into something inhuman. They crashed together, chair toppling, both bodies hitting the floor hard. The blade came down, found flesh, Lisa's left shoulder, a deep stab that sent lightning bolts of agony through her nervous system. But she kept screaming, kept fighting, adrenaline and survival instinct overriding pain signals. Her nursing training manifested in strategic strikes, eyes, throat, groin, targeting vulnerable areas that could disable even larger attackers. The commotion was audible despite soundproofing. Neighbors, accustomed to ignoring disturbances, found themselves unable to dismiss the intensity of the screaming, the crashes and thuds that suggested serious violence. Someone called 911. Police were dispatched. Sirens grew closer, their wailing promise of intervention and justice. Cordell heard them too. For the first time in 33 months of killing, panic replaced his usual cold control. He had seconds to decide: finish killing Lisa and face certain capture, or flee and hope to escape the city before police identified him. Survival instinct overrode bloodlust. He kicked Lisa hard enough to break ribs, buying himself precious seconds, then ran. Police arrived 90 seconds later, breaking down Cordell's apartment door to find Lisa Chun bleeding heavily but conscious. Her survival instinct and medical training keeping her alive despite significant injuries. She gave officers a detailed description of her attacker, right down to the scar above his left eyebrow and the specific brand of cigarettes he smoked. The apartment yielded a treasure trove of evidence: blood traces from previous victims that bleach hadn't quite eliminated, tools bearing microscopic tissue samples, carpet fibers that would match materials found with some of the bodies eventually discovered. The manhunt for Cordell Farrington began immediately. His name, photograph, and vehicle description were broadcast across New England. He made it as far as Hartford, Connecticut, before a state trooper spotted his car at a rest stop and called for backup. Cordell, exhausted and knowing the game was over, surrendered without resistance, his face showing no emotion as handcuffs closed around his wrists. The subsequent investigation revealed the full scope of his crimes. Under interrogation, Cordell displayed disturbing cooperativeness, confessing to 12 murders in clinical detail, describing torture techniques with the same detachment someone might use discussing cooking recipes. He showed no remorse, no recognition that his victims had been human beings with value and dignity. They were objects to him, always had been, and his only regret was getting caught before he could kill more. The bodies were located using information Cordell provided, some in landfills, some in construction sites that had been built over, several never recovered despite his directions. Families who'd searched for missing loved ones finally received answers, though the answers brought anguish rather than closure. No one wants to learn their child, sibling, or parent suffered hours of torture before death mercifully arrived. The trial was swift by murder case standards. Cordell's confessions and the physical evidence were overwhelming. Lisa Chun testified, describing her ordeal in detail that left the courtroom silent and shaken. Forensic experts presented findings about previous victims, about the systematic nature of the torture, about the complete absence of mercy or hesitation in Cordell's methodology. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on 12 counts of first-degree murder and numerous lesser charges. The judge, a veteran of Boston's criminal courts who'd seen humanity's worst, struggled to maintain composure while pronouncing sentence. 12 consecutive life terms without possibility of parole, to be served in maximum security at MCI Cedar Junction, formerly known as Massachusetts Correctional Institute, Walpole. Cordell showed no reaction to the sentence. No tears, no anger, no recognition that he'd lost everything. He was escorted from the courtroom in shackles, his face a mask of indifference, his mind already adjusting to new circumstances. The monster had been caged, but the darkness inside remained unchanged, unrepentant, waiting patiently for opportunities that would never arrive. Lisa Chun required months of physical therapy to recover from her injuries and years of psychological counseling to process the trauma of her near-death experience. But she survived, the one victim who escaped Cordell Farrington's killing room alive, whose courage and quick thinking had finally stopped a predator who might otherwise have continued hunting for years longer. The families of Cordell's victims struggled with grief complicated by the horrific nature of their loved ones' deaths. No memorial service could adequately address the brutality their family members had endured. No words could soften the knowledge that the final hours of life had been consumed by unimaginable suffering. Support groups formed, bringing together people bound by shared tragedy, by the common experience of loving someone who'd become prey to a remorseless predator. Boston itself changed in subtle but measurable ways. The case forced uncomfortable conversations about how society treats its most vulnerable members. The homeless, the addicted, the mentally ill who drift through city streets largely invisible until they vanish entirely. Cordell Farrington had exploited that invisibility, had weaponized society's indifference against victims who deserved protection but received only neglect. Advocacy groups emerged demanding better resources for homeless populations, improved mental health services, more aggressive investigation of missing persons cases regardless of the victim's social status. Denise Matthews, Marcus Thompson, Angela Rodriguez, and the others would never benefit from these changes, but perhaps their deaths could prevent future tragedies, could force systemic improvements that might save lives down the line. Detective Raymond Walsh, the lead investigator on the Farrington case, retired 2 years after the conviction. The case had broken something inside him, had exposed him to cruelty that challenged his fundamental belief in human decency. In retirement, he volunteered with organizations serving homeless populations, driven by complicated guilt over the victims he'd failed to save because their disappearances hadn't triggered sufficient investigation. He carried photographs of all 12 confirmed victims in his wallet, faces that haunted his dreams, reminders of the cost when society fails its most vulnerable. The soundproofed room in Cordell's former apartment was demolished during building renovations, the physical space erased though the psychic stain remained. New tenants moved into the building unaware of the horrors that had occurred just floors below their apartments, living ordinary lives in spaces shadowed by extraordinary evil. Prison life suited Cordell in unexpected ways. The rigid structure, the isolation, the absence of complex social demands, all aligned with his preference for control and predictability. He kept to himself, avoided gangs and politics, maintained the same low profile that had served him well on the streets. Other inmates sensed something fundamentally wrong about him, gave him wide berth, understood instinctively that Cordell Farrington was dangerous in ways that transcended physical threat. Psychologists and criminologists sought interviews, hoping to understand the mind of a serial killer, to map the psychological terrain that produces such profound inhumanity. Cordell occasionally agreed to these sessions, speaking with clinical detachment about his crimes, displaying no emotional connection to the suffering he'd inflicted. The professionals left these encounters disturbed, having glimpsed something they couldn't fully comprehend. A human consciousness so alien, so divorced from normal empathy and moral reasoning, that it defied categorization. One psychologist described Cordell as a black hole in human form, not radiating malevolence, but rather consuming everything around him, including light itself. Another noted that interviewing Cordell was like conversing with a sophisticated computer program mimicking human speech, while completely lacking the emotional substructure that gives human communication meaning and depth. Years passed. Cordell aged behind bars, his hair graying, his body softening with the sedentary routine of prison life. But the darkness inside remained unchanged, undiminished by time or consequence. In rare, candid moments, he admitted to guards that he missed the kills, missed the power and control, missed watching life drain from eyes that moments before had held consciousness and fear. He felt no guilt, no remorse, no recognition that he'd committed acts of profound evil. To him, the victims had been objects, tools for satisfying urges he could no more control than breathing. This absence of remorse haunted everyone who encountered him. Society has frameworks for understanding passionate crimes, for criminals who express regret or claim temporary insanity or point to mitigating circumstances. But Cordell offered nothing. No excuses, no justifications, no emotional hooks that might allow connection or comprehension. He was simply himself, a predator who'd hunted humans the way others might hunt deer, and who felt no more moral conflict about his actions than a lion feels about killing gazelles. The 20th anniversary of his conviction brought renewed media attention. True crime documentaries featured the case. Lisa Chen agreed to limited interviews describing her survival, and former detectives reflected on the investigation. The coverage forced Boston to remember, to confront again the reality that monsters walk among us, that evil doesn't announce itself with obvious signs but hides behind ordinary faces and unremarkable lives. Some of Cordell's victims' families participated in these documentaries, wanting the world to know their loved ones as people rather than statistics, wanting to reclaim humanity that Cordell had tried to strip away. They shared photographs of happier times, told stories of laughter and love and moments of connection, insisted that addiction or homelessness didn't define these people any more than Cordell's violence would be allowed to define them posthumously. Denise Matthews' mother appeared on camera, aged by grief but determined to honor her daughter's memory. She spoke about the bright child Denise had been, the dreams she'd harbored before heroin stole her future, the phone calls from jail where Denise would promise to get clean and rebuild her life. "She was still my baby," the elderly woman said, tears streaming down weathered cheeks. "She still deserved to live. She still deserved better than what he did to her." Marcus Thompson's younger brother, himself a veteran who'd managed to navigate post-military life more successfully, described the guilt of survival, the wondering whether more intervention might have saved Marcus from the streets and ultimately from Cordell's apartment. "He served his country," the brother said, voice thick with emotion. "He came home broken, and instead of helping him heal, we let him fall through the cracks. And then that monster found him in those cracks." The documentaries served as stark reminder that serial killers don't emerge from vacuum. They exploit vulnerabilities created by societal failures, by the gaps in social safety nets, by the indifference that allows human beings to become invisible even as they walk among us. Cordell Farrington was individually responsible for his crimes, but the conditions that enabled those crimes reflected broader systemic failures that made certain populations easy prey. Prison officials reported that Cordell watched some of these documentaries when they aired on common area televisions, his face betraying no emotion as victims' families described their grief, as Lisa Chun recounted her near-death experience, as experts analyzed his psychology and methodology. Guards found this more disturbing than if he'd shown anger or agitation. The complete absence of human response to human suffering marked him as fundamentally broken in ways that no intervention could repair. As Cordell entered his 60s, health issues began accumulating. Diabetes, high blood pressure, the wear of decades behind bars. Prison healthcare kept him alive but offered no comfort, no dignity, no gentleness. He faced mortality the same way he'd faced everything, with cold indifference, no fear of death, no hope for redemption, no last-minute spiritual awakening. He would die as he'd lived, emotionally flat, psychologically isolated, a cautionary tale about the monsters humanity occasionally produces. The legacy of Cordell Farrington extended beyond his direct victims. Law enforcement changed protocols for investigating missing persons, particularly involving vulnerable populations. Training programs incorporated lessons from the case, teaching officers to recognize patterns that might indicate serial predation, to take seriously every missing person report regardless of the individual's social status. The changes came too late for Denise, Marcus, Angela, and the others, but might save future victims from similar fates. Lisa Chun became an advocate for victims' rights and self-defense education. She conducted workshops teaching women escape techniques, survival strategies, ways to resist and survive violent encounters. Her own near-death experience gave her credibility and urgency that no theoretical instruction could match. She turned trauma into purpose, transforming her victimization into a platform for helping others avoid similar fates. The city of Boston erected a small memorial in the South End, acknowledging the victims whose lives had been stolen on its streets. 12 names carved in granite, simple and dignified, offering no details of how they died but honoring that they'd lived. Family members visited regularly, leaving flowers, photographs, small mementos that personalized each name, insisted on individual humanity rather than collective victimhood. Cordell Farrington would die in prison, that much was certain. 12 consecutive life sentences without parole meant he would never again walk free streets, never again hunt vulnerable prey, never again exercise the absolute power over life and death that had driven his killing spree. The monster was caged permanently, his threat neutralized, his capacity for future harm eliminated. But the damage lingered. In the nightmares of survivors and families, in the changed protocols and advocacy efforts, in the memorial stones and documentary footage, in the collective memory of a city that learned hard lessons about the evil hiding in plain sight. Cordell Farrington had taken 12 lives directly, but had damaged dozens more indirectly. Family members, friends, investigators, neighbors who'd unknowingly lived near a killer, everyone who'd been touched by the rippling consequences of his violence. The final accounting of Cordell Farrington's life would show a balance sheet drowning in red ink. Lives destroyed, suffering inflicted, trauma compounded across families and communities. Against this, he offered nothing. No artistic legacy, no intellectual contribution, no moments of kindness or connection that might complicate the moral calculus. He was simply and entirely a force for destruction, a predator who'd consumed what he could reach until finally stopped by a woman brave enough to fight back and lucky enough to survive. In the end, that's what saved Boston from further bloodshed. Not sophisticated police work, not criminal profiling, not surveillance technology or forensic science. It was Lisa Chen's courage and quick thinking, her refusal to accept victimhood passively, her willingness to risk death fighting rather than accept torture submissively. One woman's extraordinary strength in the face of unimaginable terror had ended a killing spree that might otherwise have continued for years. Cordell Farrington remains imprisoned as of this writing, an elderly man serving time that will never end, living his final years in maximum security cells, his days measured in routine indignities and declining health. He grants no interviews anymore, speaks to no one except when absolutely necessary, exists in self-imposed isolation that mirrors the emotional isolation he maintained throughout his free life. The story of Cordell Farrington serves as a reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself dramatically. Sometimes it wears ordinary faces, speaks in unremarkable voices, moves through society undetected until suddenly, horribly, it's too late for those caught in its grip. Vigilance, compassion for vulnerable populations, and willingness to investigate when someone disappears. These are the defenses society possesses against predators who hunt among us. 12 families learned this lesson through devastating loss. One woman learned it through surviving what should have killed her. And an entire city learned that the monsters we fear in darkness are sometimes the ones we pass on the street, never recognizing the threat until victims start disappearing and screams echo through soundproofed rooms no one knew existed. The Blood Merchant of Boston operated for 33 months, claiming at least 12 lives. inflicting suffering that defied description, and ultimately proving that the capacity for evil exists within the human heart, waiting for opportunity, weakness, and the perfect storm of circumstances that transforms dark impulses into darker actions. Cordell Farrington is that proof, walking evidence that monsters are real, and they look exactly like us. In the years following Cordell Farrington's conviction, Boston continued processing the trauma his killing spree had inflicted. The case remained referenced in criminology courses, studied by behavioral analysts, dissected by true crime enthusiasts seeking to understand how one man could inflict such systematic horror while avoiding detection for so long. The victims, 12 confirmed, possibly more unconfirmed, were never forgotten. Annual memorial services brought together families, survivors, advocates, and law enforcement officials who'd worked the case. These gatherings served as a reminder that behind every crime statistic stood real people, individuals with complex lives and relationships, humans who deserved to be remembered for more than how they died. Lisa Chin married in 1995, had 2 children, and built a life that refused to be defined solely by her brush with death. She carried scars, physical reminders on her shoulder, psychological wounds that occasionally surfaced as nightmares or anxiety, but also carried forward with determination to live fully despite what Cordell Farrington had tried to take from her. The case changed how Boston approached homelessness and addiction, sparked conversations about vulnerability and social responsibility, forced uncomfortable reckonings about whose lives society values and protects. These changes emerged too slowly for some advocates, but they emerged nonetheless, incremental progress built on foundations of tragedy. Cordell Farrington himself faded from public consciousness, another imprisoned killer among thousands, his name mentioned only when true crime shows revisited the case or when parole hearings, purely procedural given his sentence, briefly returned his story to local news. He aged without dignity, his body failing as bodies do, his mind remaining dark and unreachable to the end. The final chapter of Cordell Farrington's story will be written in a prison infirmary or cell, his death noted in brief obituaries that recount his crimes and conviction. No one will mourn him. No memorial service will honor his memory. He will be buried in a prison cemetery, marked by a simple numbered stone, forgotten by everyone except those he harmed and those who study human evil professionally. Justice was served, as much as justice can be served in cases of such profound horror. The killer was caught, convicted, imprisoned for life. The system worked, eventually, though not quickly enough to save 12 victims who deserved to live, who had value and humanity that Cordell Farrington refused to recognize. Their names deserve final mention, final acknowledgement, final honoring. Denise Matthews, Marcus Thompson, Angela Rodriguez, James Patterson, Keisha Williams, Robert Chin, Maria Sanchez, Devin Walker, Christine O'Brien, Tyrone Mitchell, Sandra Phillips, Thomas Riley. 12 human beings, 12 lives stolen, 12 families shattered. May they rest in peace, and may their stories remind us always to protect the vulnerable, investigate the missing, and remain vigilant against the monsters who walk among us wearing human masks. If you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we dive into true crime stories with calmness and respect. A special shout out to my amazing subscribers who've been with me from the start. Thank you for your incredible support. If you're still with me, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Or just say hello so I know you're still here. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and hit subscribe so you won't miss any of our upcoming true crime stories perfect for winding down. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. The Kashursky Maniac. Death wore a construction worker's face in the shadows of Moscow's industrial district, and for 3 blood-soaked years, nobody recognized him. The metal pipes came down with surgical precision. One blow to shatter consciousness, another to extinguish life. Between 1992 and 1995, Moscow's Kashursky district transformed into a hunting ground where women vanished into darkness and emerged as broken shells of humanity. The killer moved through the district like a ghost, selecting victims with calculated patience, striking with devastating speed, and disappearing before screams could fade into the frigid Russian air. His weapon of choice left skulls fractured, faces unrecognizable, and investigators chasing shadows through a maze of industrial ruins. This is the story of Andrei Yezhov, the construction worker who built a legacy of terror one murdered woman at a time, and the desperate hunt to stop him before Moscow streets ran red with the blood of the innocent. The collapse of the Soviet Union didn't just destroy an empire, it unleashed demons that had been lurking in the wreckage of broken systems and shattered dreams. While the world watched Moscow transform through political upheaval, something darker evolved in the industrial wasteland of Kashursky district. The year was 1992, and amid the chaos of societal collapse, Andrei Yezhov discovered what he truly was. Born in 1964, Yezhov grew up in the gray monotony of Soviet life, where individuality suffocated under the weight of collective conformity. His childhood offered no obvious warnings, no clear signposts pointing toward the monster he would become. He attended school, completed his education, and eventually found work in construction, a profession that suited the physical strength concealed within his unremarkable frame. To neighbors, colleagues, and casual acquaintances, he existed as little more than background noise in the symphony of urban life. Forgettable, ordinary, safe. But behind the mask of normalcy, something malignant was taking root. The economic devastation that followed the Soviet collapse created perfect conditions for predators. Law enforcement resources dwindled as crime rates exploded. Police departments struggled with inadequate funding, outdated equipment, and overwhelming caseloads. The social safety nets that had once provided structure, however oppressive, disintegrated overnight. Women found themselves particularly vulnerable, forced into dangerous circumstances just to survive. They walked dark streets alone, worked late shifts in isolated areas, and navigated a city that had become unrecognizable in its lawlessness. Yezhov watched them. He studied their patterns, memorized their routines, and fantasized about power in its most primal form. The transformation from fantasy to action occurred on a night that seemed no different from any other. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and Moscow's streets glistened with ice that reflected the sickly glow of sodium streetlights. Yezhov had been working late, as he often did, his hands raw from handling frozen metal and concrete. He carried his tools with him, including several lengths of metal pipe that would become synonymous with terror. His first victim appeared as if summoned by his darkest impulses. She was a young woman, perhaps in her mid-20s, making her way home through the industrial district where factories loomed like sleeping giants and abandoned warehouses offered countless hiding places. Her footsteps echoed against concrete walls, creating a rhythm that matched the pounding of Yezhov's accelerating heartbeat. He followed at a distance, watching her breath materialize in white clouds, observing the way she pulled her coat tighter against the bitter cold. She never heard him approach. The attack lasted seconds but would echo through decades. Yezhov struck from behind, the metal pipe whistling through freezing air before connecting with devastating force. The sound, a wet, crushing impact, would become his signature. She crumpled without crying out, her body folding like a puppet with severed strings. But Yezhov didn't stop. He struck again, and again. The pipe rose and fell with mechanical precision, each blow driven by a hunger that had finally found its outlet. When he finally stopped, his chest heaved with exertion and something far more disturbing: exhilaration. The woman lay motionless, her face destroyed beyond recognition, blood pooling beneath her head in a spreading dark stain that steamed in the frozen air. Yezhov stood over her, gripping the pipe with hands that didn't tremble. No guilt twisted his features. No horror at what he'd done caused him to flee in panic. Instead, he felt power, control, satisfaction. He dragged her body into the shadows between two warehouses, positioned her carefully, and walked away. His work boots left bloody prints that faded within a few steps, washed away by melting ice and falling snow. By morning, he was just another construction worker heading to another job site, the pipe cleaned and tucked away with his other tools. The discovery of the body sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. Residents who already felt unsafe now faced a new nightmare. A killer who struck without warning, who transformed familiar streets into death traps. Police arrived to process the scene, but the investigation immediately faced obstacles. The extreme violence had obliterated identifying features, making victim identification difficult. The harsh weather had compromised physical evidence. And with crime rates soaring across the city, this murder became one case among hundreds screaming for attention. But for Yezhov, something fundamental had changed. The murder didn't satisfy him, it awakened him. The rush of power, the godlike control over life and death, the intoxicating sensation of reducing a living, breathing human being to broken meat and shattered bone. These feelings consumed his thoughts. He returned to work, moved through daily routines, and projected perfect normalcy while internally replaying every second of the killing. He needed to do it again. The second murder came 3 weeks later. Different location, same district. Another young woman, another frozen night, another metal pipe descending with lethal force. This time Yezhov refined his approach. He selected a victim who walked alone through an even more isolated area. He positioned himself to attack from a blind spot, eliminating any chance she might see him coming. And he struck with even greater savagery, the pipe rising and falling in a frenzy that went beyond killing into something approaching annihilation. The pattern was established. The methodology was perfected. And Moscow's Kashursky district had gained a monster who wore humanity like a costume. As weeks became months, Yezhov developed his hunting routine with the same precision he applied to construction work. He identified locations offering maximum isolation, areas where screams wouldn't carry, where bodies wouldn't be immediately discovered, where escape routes remained clear. He studied potential victims, learning to recognize vulnerability. Women walking alone, women distracted by exhaustion or cold, women whose circumstances forced them through dangerous areas despite the risks. He also learned to control the violence, not to diminish it, but to channel it more effectively. Early attacks had been frenzied, almost experimental, but as his confidence grew, Yezhov discovered optimal striking patterns. The first blow to the head incapacitated the victim instantly, eliminating any chance of escape or effective resistance. Subsequent blows ensured death while allowing him to indulge the rage that drove him. He learned how much force to apply, where to strike for maximum damage, how to kill quickly while still satisfying his need for brutality. The police began recognizing a pattern. Multiple women found murdered in Kashursky district, all killed with similar weapons, all displaying comparable levels of violence. The killings bore the unmistakable signature of a serial predator, someone who killed not from passion or immediate motive but from compulsion. Investigators started using terms like serial killer and sexual sadist. Though Yezhov's crimes showed no evidence of sexual assault, his motivation seemed purer in its darkness. He killed because killing itself satisfied him. But identifying a pattern and stopping a killer required different skill sets, and the Moscow police of the early 1990s struggled with both. Resources remained stretched impossibly thin. Communication between different districts was poor. Forensic technology lagged far behind Western standards. And the sheer volume of violent crime meant that even serial murders competed for attention with kidnappings, gang violence, and emerging organized crime operations. Yezhov moved through this chaos like a shark through bloody water. He maintained his construction job, showing up consistently, performing adequately, raising no suspicions. Colleagues knew him as quiet, competent, unremarkable. He didn't boast or draw attention. He participated in casual conversations without revealing anything meaningful about himself. When murders were discussed, and they were constantly, because fear had become the city's dominant emotion, Yezhov expressed the same concern and disgust as everyone else. His home life was similarly unremarkable. He lived alone in a modest apartment, maintained basic cleanliness, and avoided behaviors that might attract scrutiny. The metal pipes that served as his murder weapons lived among his legitimate construction tools, indistinguishable from items any worker in his profession might own. Even if police had searched his apartment, which they never did, they would have found nothing obviously incriminating. This ordinariness became his greatest asset. Police searched for monsters, but Yezhov understood that real monsters don't announce themselves. They blend in. They smile at neighbors. They hold doors for strangers. They exist as human wallpaper, so unremarkable that witnesses literally cannot remember seeing them even when they were present. By the end of 1992, at least 6 women had died at his hands. 6 families destroyed. 6 lives erased with metal pipe precision. And the killer responsible continued working, living, existing in plain sight while Moscow's Kashursky district descended deeper into terror. The winter cold intensified, and with it came increased vulnerability. Women bundled in heavy coats and scarves had reduced peripheral vision. They hurried through streets with heads down against freezing winds. They took shortcuts through dangerous areas to minimize exposure to the brutal weather. Every environmental factor that made survival more difficult simultaneously made Yezhov's hunting easier. He struck again in December, then January, then February. The bodies accumulated like snowdrifts, each one bearing the same horrific injuries. Crushed skulls, shattered facial bones, trauma so severe that identification required dental records when those were even available. Some victims remained nameless for weeks, their deaths announced through desperate missing person reports that families filed with dwindling hope. The media began covering the killings extensively. Newspapers ran headlines about the Kashursky maniac, a nickname that would become permanently attached to Yezhov. Television broadcasts warned women to avoid walking alone, to travel in groups, to report suspicious behavior immediately. Community meetings devolved into angry demands for police action, for protection, for answers that investigators couldn't provide. Through it all, Yezhov remained invisible. He attended those same community meetings, expressing manufactured outrage about police incompetence. He consoled frightened colleagues at work sites, offering platitudes about staying safe. And when darkness fell, he hunted. The psychological mechanics driving Yezhov remained opaque even to him. He didn't torture himself with questions about why he killed. He didn't seek to understand the compulsion that sent him prowling through frozen streets with murder in his heart. He simply accepted this aspect of himself the way others accepted their need for food or sleep. Killing had become fundamental to his identity, as natural and necessary as breathing. But the fundamental question haunted investigators. How does someone become this? What sequence of events, what combination of nature and nurture, transforms a human being into something that can obliterate other human beings without remorse? Yezhov's childhood offered no clear answers. He hadn't been obviously abused or traumatized. His family life, while not warm, hadn't been exceptionally cruel. He'd shown no early signs of the classic warning indicators: no animal torture, no fire setting, no childhood violence. Yet here he existed, a fully formed predator, operating with cold efficiency in one of the world's largest cities, and nobody could stop him. Spring arrived in Moscow, but it brought no relief from terror. If anything, the thaw made things worse. Bodies that had been preserved by winter cold began decomposing, revealing kills that had gone undiscovered during the frozen months. The true scope of Yezhov's rampage became horrifyingly clear. This wasn't a killer who struck occasionally. This was someone who hunted with frightening regularity, someone for whom murder had become routine. The investigative team assigned to the Kashursky maniac case grew as political pressure mounted. District officials faced furious constituents who demanded action. Moscow's central government, embarrassed by international media coverage, allocated additional resources. A task force formed specifically to hunt Yezhov, though at this point they didn't know his name, didn't have his face, didn't possess any meaningful leads that might identify him. What they did have were bodies. 11 confirmed victims by spring 1993, all women, all killed in similar fashion, all found in Kashursky district. The geographic clustering suggested a local resident, someone familiar with the area's layout, someone who knew which streets remained empty at night, which buildings offered concealment, which routes provided escape. Detective Viktor Grimov led the investigation, a veteran investigator whose career had spanned the Soviet era into the chaotic present. He'd seen his share of horrors, political killings, organized crime executions, domestic murders, but the Kashursky maniac case disturbed him in ways others hadn't. The sheer brutality suggested rage, yet the consistency indicated control. The victims appeared random, yet the geographic pattern showed deliberation. Everything about the case contradicted itself, presenting paradoxes that conventional investigative logic couldn't resolve. Grimoff assembled case files in a conference room that became headquarters for the manhunt. Photographs of victims covered one wall. Not the crime scene photos showing destroyed faces, but pictures from life. Images provided by families desperate for any information about their murdered daughters, sisters, mothers. These women smiled from the wall, frozen in happier moments, their eyes holding futures that Yezhov had extinguished. The detective studied patterns obsessively. Victim age ranged from 19 to 41, but most clustered in their 20s and 30s. No obvious physical type emerged. Some were tall, some short, some heavy, some slim. Hair color varied. Socioeconomic backgrounds differed. The only consistent factor was their gender and their misfortune of being alone in Kashursky district when Yezhov decided to hunt. Forensic analysis of the murder weapon provided frustratingly generic information. The killer used metal pipes, approximately 40 centimeters long, diameter consistent with construction materials. But in a district where construction work was ubiquitous, where thousands of workers carried similar tools, this information narrowed the suspect pool by precisely 0. Meanwhile, Yezhov continued killing. He'd discovered an optimal rhythm, frequent enough to satisfy his compulsion, but spaced sufficiently to avoid creating a predictable pattern. Sometimes weeks passed between murders. Other times, multiple victims died within days. This irregularity prevented police from anticipating his next strike, from flooding potential hunting grounds with officers who might intercept him. The seventh murder of 1993 occurred on a humid June evening. The victim was Svetlana Markova, 27 years old, an accountant making her way home after working late. She lived only 15 minutes from her office, a route she'd walked hundreds of times. But on this particular night, that familiar path intersected with Yezhov's hunting ground. He'd been watching her for 3 days, studying her routine, confirming she walked alone. The attack occurred in a narrow passage between 2 apartment buildings, a shortcut that saved perhaps 2 minutes but offered complete isolation from street traffic. Svetlana entered the passage at 10:47 p.m. According to security footage from a nearby shop, she never emerged. Yezhov waited in the darkness, positioned where shadows completely concealed him. He'd learned patience during his hunting career, learned to remain motionless for extended periods, barely breathing, existing as little more than a human-shaped void. When Svetlana passed his hiding spot, he moved with explosive speed. The first blow struck the base of her skull with precision born from practice. The pipe's impact produced a sound like a watermelon splitting, wet, hollow, final. Svetlana's legs buckled instantly, her nervous system short-circuiting as trauma disrupted brain function. She collapsed forward, hands instinctively reaching toward her head, a gesture of protection that came too late to matter. But Yezhov wasn't finished. He never was after the initial strike. The killing blow might have been enough, but the attack satisfied something beyond simple murder. He needed to see the destruction, needed to feel bone shatter, needed to reduce his victims to broken things that bore no resemblance to the people they'd been moments before. He struck her head repeatedly, each impact producing progressively sickening sounds as structure gave way to pulp. Blood sprayed across the passage walls in arterial patterns that would help investigators reconstruct the violence. Svetlana's skull fractured, then collapsed inward, facial bones splintering under the relentless assault. Within 30 seconds, she'd been transformed from a living woman with hopes and fears and plans for tomorrow into a corpse so damaged that her own mother would struggle to recognize her. Yezhov stood over the body, chest heaving, blood speckling his face and hands. The exhilaration lasted longer now than it had in early kills, minutes instead of seconds. He'd refined his technique to maximize satisfaction, learned to channel the violence in ways that provided maximum psychological reward. Eventually, the euphoria faded enough for practical considerations to reassert themselves. He dragged Svetlana's body deeper into the shadows, positioned it carefully, and departed. He carried a change of clothes in his work bag, a habit he'd developed after the first few kills. Within minutes, the blood-spattered shirt and jacket were replaced with clean garments. The murder weapon went back into his tool bag, indistinguishable from legitimate equipment. Svetlana's body wasn't discovered until the following morning, found by a resident taking out trash. The screams brought neighbors rushing to windows, and within minutes, police sirens wailed through the district. Detective Grimoff arrived to find a crime scene that had become grimly familiar. Extreme violence, metal pipe weapon, lone female victim, no witnesses, minimal evidence. The detective stood in the passage where Svetlana had died, trying to understand the mind that could produce such savagery. The blood patterns told a story of sustained, deliberate violence. This wasn't a killing driven by rage or passion. This was methodical destruction carried out with almost workmanlike efficiency. The killer hadn't panicked, hadn't rushed, hadn't made obvious mistakes. He'd murdered Svetlana, arranged her body, and vanished like smoke. Grimoff ordered expanded patrols throughout Kashursky district, but he knew it was largely theatrical. They couldn't position officers on every street, in every shadow, along every route. The district sprawled across too much territory, contained too many isolated spaces, and the killer had already demonstrated remarkable skill at remaining undetected despite these patrols. He moved through police presence like it didn't exist. The summer brought no respite. Bodies continued appearing with horrifying regularity. Each new victim generated fresh headlines, fresh panic, fresh anger directed at police who seemed powerless to stop the carnage. Grimoff's task force grew larger and more desperate, following leads that went nowhere, interviewing witnesses who'd seen nothing, collecting evidence that revealed nothing. Yezhov, meanwhile, refined his craft with the dedication of an artisan perfecting a technique. He varied his hunting grounds slightly, expanding his territory to include adjacent neighborhoods while maintaining Kashursky district as his primary domain. He altered his attack timing, sometimes striking in early evening, other times waiting until after midnight. He experimented with different body disposal methods. Some victims left in plain sight, others hidden in locations where discovery might take days. But the core methodology remained constant. Identify a vulnerable woman, follow until opportunity presented itself, strike with overwhelming violence, disappear completely. The psychological toll on the community became almost as devastating as the murders themselves. Women lived in constant fear, altering their entire lives to avoid becoming another victim. They refused to walk anywhere alone, arranged escorts for even short distances, abandoned jobs or routines that required movement through dangerous areas. The district's normal rhythms disintegrated as fear dictated behavior. Men faced suspicion everywhere. Every stranger became a potential killer. Women clutched weapons, keys, pepper spray, whatever might provide protection. Trust evaporated. The social fabric that held communities together frayed under the sustained assault of terror. By autumn 1993, the confirmed victim count reached 18. 18 women whose lives ended in brutal violence. 18 families destroyed. 18 unsolved murders mocking police efforts to stop the killer. The winter of 1993 to 1994 brought changes to Yezhov's pattern, subtle shifts that demonstrated disturbing evolution. His earlier kills, while brutal, had been relatively quick: strike, kill, disappear. But as time progressed and confidence grew, he began allowing himself additional time with victims, lingering at crime scenes, arranging bodies in specific poses that suggested increasing psychological complexity. The 20th victim, found in January 1994, showed these changes. Marina Volkov, 32 years old, had been posed after death, her body positioned against a wall in a sitting position, hands folded in her lap like a macabre mannequin. The staging served no practical purpose. It actually increased Yezhov's risk by requiring additional time at the crime scene. But it satisfied some internal need for expression, some desire to communicate through the destruction he created. Detective Grimoff recognized this evolution as both opportunity and danger. On one hand, the staging might provide psychological insights that could help profile the killer. On the other hand, it suggested someone becoming more comfortable, more confident, more willing to take risks because previous risks had brought no consequences. The task force brought in psychological experts, specialists who studied serial killers and violent predators. They analyzed crime scene photos, reviewed autopsy reports, and constructed profiles of the killer's likely characteristics. The consensus painted a disturbing picture. Male, mid-20s to mid-30s, physically strong, local resident, employed in manual labor, likely lives alone, probably unremarkable in appearance and demeanor. The profile described thousands of Moscow residents, providing no practical investigative value. But one psychologist, Dr. Elena Petrova, offered insights that resonated with Gromov. She explained that the level of violence indicated someone who experienced killing as deeply pleasurable, someone for whom murder satisfied fundamental psychological needs. He's not killing out of rage or hatred for his victims specifically, she explained during a team briefing. The women are objects to him, opportunities to experience the sensation of power. The violence is the point, not a means to an end, but the end itself. This understanding helped frame the investigation differently. They weren't looking for someone with obvious connections to victims, someone with discernible motives. They were hunting a predator who killed because killing fulfilled him, and who would continue until someone stopped him. The spring thaw of 1994 revealed 3 previously undiscovered bodies, victims who'd been killed during winter and remained hidden under snow. The true death toll climbed into the mid-20s, though exact numbers became difficult to confirm. Some missing person cases might represent additional victims. Other murders might have been attributed to different killers when they were actually Yezhov's work. Public pressure reached fever pitch. Politicians called for the police commissioner's resignation. Media coverage became increasingly critical, questioning law enforcement competence. Citizens organized self-defense groups and vigilante patrols, though these efforts proved ineffective against a killer who struck without warning and disappeared completely. Yezhov absorbed all this chaos with quiet satisfaction. He read newspaper coverage of his crimes, watched television reports, and experienced a sense of accomplishment that normal achievements could never provide. He'd become significant, notorious, feared. The city knew his work even if it didn't know his name. This recognition fed his compulsion, validating the importance of what he'd discovered within himself. But with confidence came carelessness. Small mistakes began accumulating. During a murder in April 1994, a witness heard screams and looked out their window in time to see a male figure fleeing the scene. The description remained frustratingly vague: average height, average build, dark clothing, but it confirmed what investigators already suspected. Male perpetrator, physically capable of overpowering victims. Another incident in May brought police closer to the truth. A woman survived an attack, though barely. Yezhov struck her from behind as usual, but the angle was slightly off, and the blow, while devastating, wasn't immediately fatal. She collapsed but remained conscious enough to see her attacker's silhouette as he raised the pipe for a second strike. A car's headlights swept across the scene at that exact moment, spoiling Yezhov's isolation. He fled immediately, prioritizing escape over completing the kill. The woman survived with severe head trauma, permanent disabilities, and fragments of memory that included her attacker's general build and the sound of his footsteps, heavy work boots on concrete. Detective Gromov interviewed her extensively once she'd recovered sufficiently to speak. Her testimony provided valuable information. The attacker moved with confidence, suggesting familiarity with the area. He carried what felt like metal pipe. He wore work clothes, heavy jacket, boots, clothing that wouldn't draw attention in an industrial district. And most importantly, he'd fled when interrupted, demonstrating that despite his violence, he remained capable of rational risk assessment. The task force refined their profile: construction worker or similar manual laborer, someone who worked in Kashursky district and knew it intimately, someone physically strong enough to overpower victims quickly, someone organized enough to carry weapons and escape without leaving evidence. They began surveying construction sites, interviewing workers, collecting names. The list of potential suspects numbered in the hundreds, but it represented progress, a manageable pool of possibilities rather than an entire city of millions. Yezhov felt the investigation tightening around him, though the pressure remained distant and abstract. Police questioned him as part of their construction worker sweep, a routine interview that lasted perhaps 15 minutes. He provided basic information, name, address, employment history, and expressed appropriate concern about the murders. The interviewing officer noted nothing suspicious, thanked him for his cooperation, and moved to the next name on the list. But that brief interaction changed something. For the first time, Yezhov understood that police were actively looking in his direction, however broadly. The thrill of invincibility diminished slightly, replaced by a new sensation: the excitement of being hunted even as he hunted others. This realization should have prompted caution, but it had the opposite effect. Yezhov accelerated his killing pace, striking twice in June, 3 times in July. The murders became more brazen, occurring in less isolated locations, at times when discovery risk increased. He was testing boundaries, pushing limits, daring the police to catch him. The victims during this period showed increased violence. The brutality had always been extreme, but now it became almost frenzied. Skulls weren't just fractured, they were obliterated. Faces weren't just damaged, they were erased. Medical examiners struggled to complete autopsies on remains so thoroughly destroyed that determining cause of death became redundant. Obviously, the victims died from cranial trauma, but the sheer excessive force suggested someone losing control or deliberately escalating for reasons investigators couldn't fathom. Dr. Petrova explained it as the inevitable progression of serial violence. "He's desensitizing," she told Gromov. "The level of violence that initially satisfied him no longer provides the same psychological reward. He needs to escalate to achieve the same effect. More victims, more brutality, more risk. It's like addiction. The dose that once worked eventually requires increase." This pattern suggested both opportunity and danger. If Yezhov was escalating and taking greater risks, he might make mistakes that would finally expose him. But the escalation also meant more victims, more families destroyed, more lives erased before police could stop him. The summer of 1994 became the deadliest period of Yezhov's rampage. Bodies appeared with horrifying frequency, sometimes multiple victims discovered within days of each other. The district descended into siege mentality. Women refused to leave their homes after dark. Streets that once bustled with activity became empty corridors where only the desperate or foolish ventured. Autumn brought cold rains that turned Moscow streets into rivers of dirty water and made police work even more miserable. Detective Gromov stood in yet another crime scene, watching forensic technicians process yet another body, and felt the weight of accumulated failure pressing down like physical force. 32 confirmed victims now. 32 women whose murders haunted him during brief attempts at sleep. 32 families whose pain he carried. But the investigation was finally beginning to converge. The construction worker angle had narrowed the suspect pool significantly. Cross-referencing employment records with geographic data revealed workers who'd been present in the district during all murder timeframes. The list contained 147 names, including Andrei Yezhov. Background checks proceeded methodically. Most suspects were eliminated quickly. Alibis for specific murders, physical characteristics inconsistent with witness descriptions, employment records showing they'd been working elsewhere during key periods. The list contracted steadily as November progressed. Yezhov remained on the list, though nothing about his background sparked particular concern. His work history showed consistent employment at various construction sites throughout Kashursky district. He had no criminal record beyond minor traffic violations. Neighbors described him as quiet, unremarkable, someone you'd pass in the hallway without noticing. Former colleagues offered similar descriptions: competent worker, kept to himself, no obvious issues. But one detail caught Gromov's attention during routine review. Yezhov's work schedules, when compared against murder timelines, showed something interesting. He'd never been verifiably working at the exact times of any murders. This didn't prove anything. Most workers weren't verifiably accounted for during off hours, but it meant he couldn't be eliminated based on alibi either. The detective ordered surveillance, a decision that stretched already limited resources but felt increasingly justified. Teams began following Yezhov, documenting his movements, photographing his activities. For weeks, they observed nothing unusual. He worked, he went home, he ran occasional errands. His life appeared mundane to the point of tedious, but patience paid dividends. On a November evening, surveillance teams watched Yezhov leave his apartment carrying his work bag despite not having any scheduled shifts. He walked through Kashursky district with evident purpose, moving through streets where multiple murders had occurred. He paused occasionally, looking around, studying his surroundings in ways that suggested more than casual interest. Officers maintained distant observation, careful not to alert him to their presence. Yezhov eventually settled into a position between two buildings, a shadowed space offering clear views of approaching pedestrians. He waited there, motionless, for nearly an hour. When a lone woman appeared, walking home through the district, Yezhov's body language changed. He became focused, intent, predatory. Officers watching through night vision equipment saw him grip something in his bag, saw him shift position to intercept the woman's path. The takedown occurred seconds before Yezhov could strike. Police swarmed from multiple directions, overwhelming him before he could react. He fought briefly, then collapsed under the weight of multiple officers. When they searched his bag, they found 3 metal pipes, their surfaces cleaned but still showing microscopic traces of biological material that would later be matched to victims. The arrest generated immediate media frenzy. The Kashursky maniac captured. The 3-year reign of terror ended. Relief swept through the district like a physical wave, though that relief was tempered by grief for those who died before police finally stopped him. Yezhov's interrogation revealed a man utterly untroubled by his actions. He confessed readily, almost eagerly, providing details about murders that hadn't even been definitively connected to him. The final confirmed victim count reached 33 women, though he hinted at others, bodies never found or deaths attributed to other causes. He described his methodology with disturbing pride, explaining how he'd selected victims, refined his technique, avoided detection. He showed no remorse, expressed no regret, demonstrated no recognition that his victims had been human beings with inherent value. They were objects to him, opportunities to experience the sensation of killing. Psychological evaluations found him legally sane, capable of understanding right from wrong, able to control his impulses even if he chose not to. This made him eligible for full criminal prosecution, and charges accumulated like snowdrifts: 33 counts of murder, multiple counts of attempted murder, weapons charges, and various related offenses. The trial became a national spectacle. Courtrooms overflowed with journalists, victims' families, and citizens desperate to understand the monster who'd terrorized their city. Yezhov sat through proceedings with eerie calm, showing interest only when prosecutors detailed his crimes with graphic precision. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence: forensic matches between the pipes found in his possession and wounds on victims, witness testimony placing him near crime scenes, his own confession corroborated by details only the killer could know. The defense offered little beyond procedural challenges and half-hearted attempts to question evidence collection methods. Victims' family members provided impact statements that reduced the courtroom to tears. Mothers described daughters who'd never come home. Husbands spoke of wives stolen away. Children, now orphaned, confronted the man who'd destroyed their families. Through it all, Yezhov remained impassive, his face showing no more emotion than stone. The verdict surprised no one: guilty on all counts. The sentencing phase brought discussion of appropriate punishment for such monstrous crimes. Russia had recently imposed a moratorium on the death penalty, leaving life imprisonment as the maximum sentence. The judge imposed 33 consecutive life terms, ensuring Yezhov would die in prison regardless of any future legal changes. As guards led him from the courtroom for the final time, Yezhov turned to look at the gallery filled with those he traumatized. His expression remained blank, unreadable, offering no explanation for the suffering he'd caused, no justification for the lives he'd obliterated. He was transferred to a maximum security facility designed to house Russia's most dangerous criminals. There, he would spend remaining years in isolation, removed from society, prevented from ever hunting again. His cell measured 3 meters by 4 meters, a cage for a predator who'd roamed free too long. The aftermath of Yezhov's capture brought no real closure for those he'd affected. Families still grieved murdered loved ones. Survivors struggled with trauma that would mark them permanently. The district slowly recovered, but shadows remained, literal and psychological, in places where women had died. Detective Gromov retired 6 months after the trial concluded, the Kashursky maniac case, his final investigation. He'd stopped Yezhov, but the victory tasted like ash. 33 women had died before police finally intervened. 33 families were destroyed. No arrest or conviction could resurrect the dead or restore what had been stolen. In his cell, Yezhov adapted to imprisonment with the same unremarkable efficiency he'd brought to everything else. He followed rules, caused no trouble, existed as just another face among thousands of inmates. Guards who supervised him noted nothing unusual about his behavior or demeanor, but in the darkness of his cell, Yezhov remembered. He replayed murders in exquisite detail, savoring memories of power and control. The killings lived within him still, preserved perfectly, available for review whenever he desired. They'd taken his freedom, locked him away from the world, but they couldn't access his mind, couldn't erase what he'd done or diminish the satisfaction those actions still provided. The Kashursky maniac case left permanent scars on Moscow's consciousness. It exposed vulnerabilities in law enforcement systems, revealed how easily predators could operate in social chaos, demonstrated the terrible price of inadequate resources and coordination. Reforms followed, improved communication between districts, better forensic capabilities, more effective serial crime investigation protocols. But those improvements came too late for 33 women whose names are etched on a memorial in Kashursky district. The monument stands in a small park where one of Yezhov's victims was found, a granite pillar bearing names and dates that mark the true cost of his 3-year rampage. Visitors still come to the memorial, even decades later. Some are family members who never fully recovered from their losses. Others are residents who remember the fear, who lived through nights when every shadow seemed to conceal death. And some are younger people, those born after Yezhov's capture, who come to understand a dark chapter in their city's history. The psychological impact of Yezhov's crimes extended far beyond his immediate victims. Therapists throughout Moscow treated patients suffering trauma from the killings. Not just survivors and families, but ordinary citizens whose sense of safety had been permanently damaged. The realization that someone could commit such sustained violence while appearing completely normal shattered fundamental assumptions about how monsters look and behave. Dr. Petrova, the psychologist who'd consulted on the investigation, later published extensive research on the case. Her work explored the phenomenon of predators who kill not from rage or hatred toward specific individuals, but from a fundamental psychological need to destroy. She described Yezhov as representing one of the most dangerous categories of serial killers, those who experience murder as intensely rewarding and develop refined methodologies to maximize both success and satisfaction. Her research included interviews with Yezhov conducted years after his imprisonment. She found him remarkably articulate about his crimes when speaking in abstract terms, though completely disconnected from any recognition of victims as human beings. He could describe his methodology with the detachment of someone discussing a hobby. He could analyze his own psychological state during murders with clinical precision. But he couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge that he'd caused genuine suffering. When Dr. Petrova asked if he felt any regret, Yezhov considered the question thoughtfully before answering. "Regret would require believing I did something wrong," he finally said. "I don't experience it that way. I did what I needed to do. The consequences for others weren't my concern." This complete absence of empathy, combined with his obvious intelligence and self-awareness, made Yezhov particularly disturbing to study. He wasn't insane in any clinical sense. He didn't suffer from delusions or hallucinations. He simply existed outside the moral framework that constrains most human behavior, free from guilt or remorse that might prevent or limit violence. The question that haunted investigators, psychologists, and citizens alike remained fundamentally unanswerable. Why? What creates someone like Yezhov? His background offered no obvious explanations. He'd experienced no catastrophic trauma, no extreme abuse, no clear precipitating events that might explain his transformation into a predator. This absence of clear causation proved almost as disturbing as the crimes themselves. suggesting that the capacity for such violence might exist closer to the surface of ordinary humanity than anyone wanted to believe. In prison, Yezhov became a subject of morbid fascination for other inmates. Some avoided him entirely, disturbed by the nature of his crimes. Others sought him out, drawn to his notoriety, hoping association might enhance their own prison status. Yezhov tolerated these interactions with characteristic detachment, neither encouraging nor rejecting attention. He spent years in a routine that varied little: wake, exercise, meals, work assignments, sleep. The monotony that might drive others to madness seemed not to affect him. He'd learned patience during his years of hunting, learned to exist in extended periods of inaction while waiting for opportunities. Prison simply represented another form of waiting. Guards who monitored him reported that Yezhov kept his cell meticulously organized, maintained excellent hygiene, and caused no disciplinary problems. This model behavior earned him minor privileges, additional reading materials, slightly extended exercise periods. But prison officials remained forever vigilant, understanding that his compliance stemmed not from rehabilitation but from strategic calculation. As years became decades, Yezhov aged in isolation. His hair grayed, his face weathered, his body weakened, but his mind remained sharp, and his memories of killing stayed vivid. In interviews conducted late in his imprisonment, he continued describing murders with disturbing clarity, recalling details that demonstrated how deeply those acts had imprinted on his consciousness. The families of his victims pursued various paths towards something resembling healing. Some found solace in faith, interpreting their losses through religious frameworks that promised eventual justice and reunion. Others channeled grief into activism, working to improve victim support systems and push for better law enforcement resources. Still others simply endured, carrying their pain through lives permanently altered by Yezhov's violence. Marina Volkov's family, the victim Yezhov had posed after death, established a foundation supporting women's safety initiatives. They funded self-defense training programs, contributed to improved street lighting in dangerous areas, and lobbied for better police response to threats against women. Their daughter's death became a catalyst for changes that might prevent others from suffering similarly. Svetlana Markova's mother never recovered. She became a fixture at the memorial, visiting almost daily to sit near her daughter's name carved in granite. Other families would find her there sometimes, and they'd share stories, not of murders but of lives. They remembered their loved ones as they'd been before Yezhov destroyed them, preserving memories of laughter and dreams and ordinary moments that became precious only in retrospect. The woman who survived Yezhov's attack, who saw his silhouette and lived to testify, struggled with survivor's guilt that therapy only partially addressed. Why had she lived when 33 others died? What cosmic lottery determined that a car's headlights would appear at precisely the moment she needed rescue? These questions tormented her, though intellectually she understood that survival required no justification. She eventually became a counselor specializing in trauma recovery, using her experience to help others navigate the aftermath of violence. Her work proved that even from profound darkness, something meaningful could emerge, not redemption for what had happened, but purpose constructed from pain. Detective Gromov, in retirement, maintained files on the Kashursky maniac case. He'd review them occasionally, not from professional necessity, but from a need to understand what he'd failed to prevent. Those 33 victims, their faces haunted him during sleepless nights. He'd stopped Yezhov eventually, but the word eventually carried the weight of lives that might have been saved if he'd worked faster, thought smarter, connected pieces sooner. His former colleagues tried reassuring him that the investigation had faced impossible obstacles: limited resources, unprecedented crime rates, a killer who left minimal evidence. But Gromov accepted no comfort from these facts. 33 women had died. That number never changed, never diminished, never became acceptable regardless of circumstances. The media coverage of Yezhov's crimes evolved over time. Initial reporting focused on sensational aspects: the brutality, the body count, the fear he generated. But later analysis explored deeper questions about social conditions that enabled his rampage. The chaos following Soviet collapse, the breakdown of support systems, the overwhelming of law enforcement. These factors hadn't created Yezhov, but they created an environment where he could operate with devastating effectiveness. Documentary filmmakers produced multiple projects examining the case from various angles. Some focused on investigative procedures, detailing how police eventually identified and captured him. Others explored psychological dimensions, using Yezhov as a case study in predatory behavior. Still others centered on victims and their families, preserving memories of those who died and documenting the lasting impact of serial violence. Yezhov declined most interview requests, participating only when discussions interested him intellectually. He seemed to enjoy analyzing his own psychology, discussing his crimes in abstract terms, demonstrating his intelligence and self-awareness. But he never acknowledged wrongdoing in any meaningful sense, never expressed authentic remorse, never demonstrated recognition that his actions had caused genuine suffering. Criminology students studied the Kashursky maniac case extensively, examining it as an example of systematic predation in urban environments. His methodology became a template for understanding how serial killers operate, selecting vulnerable victims, exploiting isolation, using readily available weapons, maintaining normal appearances that prevent suspicion. The case illustrated that real monsters rarely announce themselves. They blend in. They exist in plain sight. They seem ordinary until revealed otherwise. In maximum security prison, Yezhov's health eventually declined. Age and confinement took their toll, weakening his body while his mind remained trapped with memories of violence. Prison medical staff treated various ailments: arthritis, high blood pressure, deteriorating vision, with the same clinical detachment he'd once brought to murder. He died in prison at age 58, his body failing after decades of isolation. The death certificate listed heart failure as the cause, though guards who'd monitored him believed he'd simply decided to stop fighting. His expression at the end remained as unreadable as it had been throughout his life, revealing nothing, explaining nothing, offering no final insights into the darkness that had consumed him. News of his death generated mixed reactions. Some victims' families felt relief that he could hurt no one else, though his death couldn't resurrect those he'd murdered. Others felt cheated of continued justice, believing life imprisonment should mean exactly that, life, however long it stretched. And some felt nothing at all, the man who'd destroyed their families having become just another ghost among many. The state cremated his remains without ceremony. No family claimed the ashes. No memorial marked his passing. He'd entered the world unremarkably and left it the same way. His only significance the trail of destruction he'd carved through 33 lives. The Kashursky district has changed considerably in the decades since Yezhov's crimes. Economic development transformed industrial wastelands into residential areas. Street lighting improved. Security systems proliferated. The physical environment that enabled his hunting no longer exists in quite the same form. But the memory persists. Longtime residents still avoid certain streets after dark, still feel echoes of fear when walking alone. Parents warn daughters about the dangers of isolation, teaching lessons learned from Yezhov's rampage. The district's history includes his crimes as indelible chapters, dark periods that can never be erased or forgotten. The memorial to his victims receives regular maintenance. The granite kept clean, flowers frequently placed near names. On certain dates, anniversaries of murders, birthdays of those who died, family members gather to remember. They tell stories of daughters, sisters, mothers, wives who existed as much more than victims. They preserve memories of laughter and kindness and ordinary humanity that Yezhov tried to erase but ultimately couldn't. Because this is the final truth about the Kashursky maniac and those he murdered. He destroyed bodies, but he couldn't completely erase the people those bodies contained. Their memories persist in those who loved them. Their impact continues through the lives they touched before death. And their names carved in granite stand as permanent testimony that they existed, they mattered, they deserved better than the violence that killed them. Andrei Yezhov sought power through destruction, control through brutality, significance through terror. He achieved notoriety, but not the kind that transcends. His name appears in criminology textbooks and true crime documentaries, but always as an example of darkness, never as anything worthy of admiration or understanding beyond clinical analysis. The women he murdered, they achieved something different. They're remembered not for how they died, but for how they lived. They're honored not as victims, but as people whose lives had value independent of the violence that ended them. And that distinction ultimately represents the most important truth about the Kashursky maniac case. Evil exists. Predators walk among us. Monsters wear human faces and live unremarkable lives until the moment they reveal what they truly are. But evil doesn't get the final word. Memory does. Love does. The refusal to let death define life does. Moscow's Kashursky district learned this lesson through unimaginable pain. 33 families absorbed it through grief that never fully heals. An entire city understood it through fear that gradually, imperfectly, transformed into resilience. And the granite memorial stands as permanent testimony to both the darkness that occurred and the light that persists despite it. Names preserved, lives remembered, humanity affirmed even in the shadow of inhuman violence. This is the story of the Kashursky maniac, not just of his crimes, but of those who suffered them, those who survived them, those who stopped them, and those who refused to let death extinguish memory. Evil happened here, but so did courage, perseverance, and the stubborn insistence that love matters more than violence, that memory outlasts destruction, that even from profound darkness, meaning can be constructed. The metal pipes have rusted into nothing. The man who wielded them has become ash. But the 33 names carved in granite remain, permanent and unchanging, declaring to everyone who passes, we existed, we mattered, we are not forgotten. And in that declaration lives the only justice possible when monsters have already done their worst, the justice of being remembered not as victims but as people, as daughters and mothers and sisters and friends, as human beings who deserved life and had it stolen, but whose significance transcends the violence that killed them. This is their story as much as his, perhaps more, because ultimately Andrei Yezhov, the Kashursky maniac, represents only temporary darkness in an ongoing human story that continues beyond his crimes, beyond his death, beyond the terror he inflicted. The memorial stands, the names endure, and Moscow remembers. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story to help you drift off to sleep. Now let's move on to our third story. Story 3. The Monster of Maracaibo. Death wore a human face in Venezuela, and it smiled while it worked. Between 2003 and 2004, two men transformed the oil-rich streets of Maracaibo into a hunting ground where screams dissolved into the humid night air and families learned that monsters don't hide under beds. They walk among us, choose their victims with chilling precision, and leave behind crime scenes so savage that even hardened detectives would wake gasping in the darkness. This is the story of Ismael Antonio Sanchez and Jose Rojas, the serial killers who proved that true evil doesn't announce itself with thunder. It whispers, it befriends, it waits, and then it destroys everything it touches. Maracaibo, Venezuela's second-largest city, sprawled across the northwestern corner of the country like a creature caught between two worlds. The shimmering waters of Lake Maracaibo reflected the petroleum derricks that had once promised prosperity, now standing as rusted monuments to broken dreams. By 2003, the city had become a pressure cooker of desperation, where poverty and wealth existed in obscene proximity, separated only by chain-link fences and the crumbling morality of those willing to cross them. Ismael Antonio Sanchez was 32 years old when he began his true descent into darkness, though the seeds had been planted long before. Born into poverty in the barrios that clung to Maracaibo's edges like barnacles on a dying ship, Ismael had learned early that survival demanded sacrifice of dignity, of conscience, of the thin membrane separating human from animal. His eyes, dark and unreflective as crude oil, had witnessed things in childhood that would have shattered weaker minds. His father, a violent alcoholic who disappeared when Ismael was 9, had taught him that power flows from fear, that dominance is the only currency that matters when you have nothing else. But Ismael possessed something that set him apart from ordinary criminals. He had intelligence, cunning, and a predator's patience. He could smile warmly while calculating the exact pressure needed to crush a windpipe. He could share a drink with someone he planned to kill within the hour, laughing at their jokes while memorizing the patterns of their breathing, the rhythm of their pulse visible in their neck. Jose Rojas was 28 when he met Ismael in early 2003, a chance encounter at a rundown bar where desperate men gathered to forget their failures. Where Ismael was calculated and controlled, Jose was chaos barely contained. Shorter, stockier, with hands that bore the scars of countless street fights, Jose had a reputation for explosive violence. He'd spent 3 years in prison for aggravated assault, and those years had carved away whatever humanity might have once existed within him. What made Jose dangerous wasn't his capacity for violence. Plenty of men in Maracaibo could throw a punch or wield a knife. What made Jose terrifying was his absolute absence of empathy. When he hurt people, he felt nothing. No remorse, no guilt, no second thoughts. He existed in a moral vacuum where other people were simply objects, things to be used or destroyed according to his needs and desires. The partnership between Ismael and Jose formed quickly, cemented by a shared worldview that recognized society's rules as suggestions to be ignored by those strong enough to break them. They began small, robbing convenience stores and mugging vulnerable targets in the city's darkened alleyways. But robbery was never enough. For men like them, violence wasn't simply a means to an end. It was the end itself, the only thing that made them feel truly alive. Their first murder happened in April 2003, and it revealed the template they would follow for the nightmare to come. The victim was Carlos Mendoza, a 43-year-old taxi driver who made the fatal mistake of picking up 2 passengers near the bus terminal just after sunset. Carlos was a father of 3, a man who worked 16-hour days to keep his family fed in an economy that devoured the working class like a starving beast. Ismael sat in the front passenger seat, chatting amiably with Carlos about football, about the rising cost of gasoline, about the government's broken promises. Jose sat silently in the back, his presence unremarkable, forgettable. When they reached the isolated area near the industrial zone, all abandoned warehouses and streets that died into dirt roads leading nowhere, Ismael's hand moved with practiced efficiency. The knife entered Carlos's side just below his ribcage, angled upward toward his heart. The taxi driver's scream was cut short by Jose's arm snaking around his throat from behind, squeezing with methodical precision. They didn't kill him quickly. That would come later, after they'd robbed him of his night's earnings, after they'd bound his hands and feet with electrical cord found in his own trunk, after they'd dragged him from the taxi and into the skeletal remains of a burned-out factory. What happened to Carlos Mendoza in that factory would set the pattern for everything that followed. They didn't simply kill him, they obliterated his humanity first. The beating lasted over an hour, a systematic destruction of flesh and bone that left Carlos unrecognizable. Jose used his fists, his boots, a metal pipe discovered among the debris. Ismael watched, occasionally participating but more often studying Jose's technique with the focused attention of a student determined to master his craft. When Carlos finally died, his body was a canvas of brutality that would haunt the investigating officers for years. Every bone in his face had been shattered. His ribs were splintered inward, puncturing lungs and liver. His hands, which had gripped a steering wheel for countless hours to provide for his children, had been deliberately crushed, each finger broken in multiple places. They left his body where it fell, not bothering to hide it. This was their first message to Maracaibo, though the city didn't yet understand it was receiving one. Nowhere was safe, no one was protected, and the monsters had stopped hiding. The police found Carlos 3 days later when the smell became impossible to ignore. The murder was brutal enough to make the local newspapers, but in a city plagued by violence, one dead taxi driver was merely another statistic in an already overwhelming catalog of crime. The investigation was assigned to an overworked detective with too many cases and too little support. Evidence was collected but never properly processed. Witnesses who might have seen the taxi driving toward the industrial zone were never interviewed. The case went cold within weeks, filed away in a basement archive where justice goes to die. For Ismael and Jose, Carlos Mendoza's murder was a revelation. They had crossed a threshold and discovered that killing was easier than they'd imagined. that the consequences were distant and theoretical, that the power they felt watching life drain from another human being was addictive beyond anything drugs or alcohol could provide. They were careful after Carlos, allowing weeks to pass before striking again. They studied their city like generals planning a campaign, identifying the weak points, the vulnerable populations, the places where people disappeared without triggering serious investigations. Maracaibo's poorest neighborhoods became their hunting grounds, places where people vanished regularly, where police response was measured in days rather than hours, where witnesses knew better than to talk to authorities who couldn't protect them. Their second victim was a young man named Ricardo Fuentes, 19 years old, who supplemented his income selling counterfeit DVDs from a blanket spread on sidewalks near the market district. Ricardo was small, slight, effeminate in a way that made him a target for harassment in a culture that prized machismo above almost everything else. Ismael and Jose approached him as potential customers near closing time, when the market was emptying and Ricardo was eager to make one last sale before packing up. They walked him to a quiet street, supposedly to show them where they'd parked their car, where they could complete the transaction away from other vendors who might demand a cut. Ricardo followed willingly, clutching his small inventory of pirated films, thinking about the extra money he'd make, perhaps enough to take his girlfriend to dinner somewhere nice. The attack came without warning. Jose struck first, a devastating punch to Ricardo's kidney that dropped him instantly to his knees. The DVDs scattered across the pavement, plastic cases cracking against concrete. Before Ricardo could scream, Ismael's hand clamped over his mouth, while Jose rained down blows with mechanical efficiency. They dragged him into the doorway of an abandoned building, working quickly now, aware that even in Maracaibo's most neglected neighborhoods, too much noise might draw attention. What they did to Ricardo Fuentes in that doorway would become their signature, a level of savagery that went far beyond what was necessary to kill, that spoke to something fundamentally broken in their psyches. Ricardo was beaten so severely that his own mother would later be unable to identify him by sight alone. His face had been rendered into something no longer recognizably human, a mass of pulped flesh and shattered bone. But the beating was only part of their ritual. They used a knife on him, not to kill efficiently but to cause maximum suffering, making shallow cuts across his torso, his arms, his legs, watching him weakening from blood loss while his muffled screams dissolved into whimpers. When they finally tired of him, when Ricardo had stopped responding to their torture, they finished it with a brutality that shocked even the coroner who would later examine his body. His throat had been cut so deeply that he was nearly decapitated, the knife sawing through muscle and cartilage with determined force. They left him in that doorway, another message delivered to a city that still wasn't listening. Ricardo's body was discovered at dawn by a garbage collector who would quit his job within a week, unable to sleep without seeing that ruined face every time he closed his eyes. 2 murders now, and the police still hadn't connected them. The detectives who caught these cases worked in isolation, drowning in their individual caseloads, never comparing notes, never looking for patterns. Ismael and Jose had discovered the perfect environment for predators. A city in crisis, a police force overwhelmed and underfunded, a population numbed by constant violence into accepting horror as routine. As 2003 progressed through its sweltering summer into equally humid autumn, Ismael Antonio Sanchez and Jose Rojas refined their methods, growing bolder, more confident, more addicted to the rush that came from complete domination over another human life. They had learned to hunt as a team, Ismael providing the intelligence and planning while Jose delivered the raw physical violence. They were becoming the most dangerous thing any society can produce, organized serial killers who understood how to exploit the gaps in civilization's defenses. The city slept, unaware that something unprecedented was moving through its streets, something that would soon force Maracaibo to confront the darkest question humanity can ask. What happens when the social contract completely breaks down, when men decide that other people's lives are meaningless, when violence becomes not a means to an end but an end in itself? The answer was coming, written in blood and screams, and it would be worse than anyone could imagine. By November 2003, Ismael and Jose had killed 7 people. 7 human beings erased from existence, their final moments filled with agony and terror that no one should ever experience. Each murder built upon the last. an escalating symphony of brutality that revealed the depths of depravity possible when two damaged souls find each other and decide that society's most fundamental rules no longer apply to them. The third victim was Maria Elena Torres, a 36-year-old sex worker who operated near the docks where oil tankers came to load their cargo. Maria Elena had 2 children living with her mother in a rural village, children she was trying to save enough money to bring to the city for better education. She wore her hardship in the lines around her eyes, in the wary way she assessed potential clients, in the knife she kept hidden in her boot. None of it saved her. Ismael and Jose picked her up around midnight, offering more money than she typically made in a week. The promise of enough cash to finally bring her children to Maracaibo overrode her usual caution. She got into their borrowed car, negotiating the terms as they drove away from the relative safety of the dock area into residential neighborhoods that gave way to industrial wasteland. What they did to Maria Elena Torres lasted through the night and into the gray hours before dawn. They took her to an abandoned factory complex, one of dozens that dotted Maracaibo's outskirts like tombstones, marking the death of Venezuela's industrial ambitions. Inside, they had prepared a space, bringing rope and tape and tools that had no legitimate purpose in what they planned. Maria Elena fought. She was stronger than they'd anticipated, fueled by desperation and maternal instinct that transcended self-preservation. She managed to cut Jose across his forearm with her hidden knife before Ismael struck her head with a piece of pipe, sending her sprawling. The wound enraged Jose, transforming his usual methodical violence into something far worse. The torture they inflicted on Maria Elena was so extreme that the investigating officers would later require counseling. She had been bound and systematically brutalized, her body bearing evidence of repeated trauma over many hours. They had burned her with cigarettes, carved words into her flesh, broken fingers individually while she begged for her life, for her children, for mercy that would never come. When they finally killed her, it was almost an afterthought, a conclusion to entertainment that had run its course. They strangled her with a length of electrical cord, watching her face as consciousness faded, as the light left her eyes and she became just another piece of meat rotting in an abandoned building. Her body wasn't discovered for 2 weeks. By then, the tropical heat and insects had rendered her nearly unidentifiable. Maria Elena's mother would wait 3 months before accepting that her daughter was never coming back, that those grandchildren would never receive the better education their mother had died trying to provide. The 4th and 5th victims came in quick succession, marking a turning point in the killer's evolution. Brothers named Santiago and Pedro Alvarez, ages 24 and 21, who worked together at a construction site. They had made the mistake of accepting a ride from Ismael and Jose after missing the last bus home, tired from a long day of manual labor under the punishing sun. Ismael drove them away from the city, talking about a shortcut that would save time, while Jose sat in back with the brothers, his stillness masking the violence coiled within him. When they reached a remote area where the paved road crumbled into dirt tracks cutting through scrubland, everything changed in an instant. Jose produced a gun, a revolver that had belonged to Carlos Mendoza, the taxi driver from their first kill. The brothers froze, hands raised instinctively, trying to comply, offering the little money they had. But Ismael and Jose weren't interested in robbery anymore. The money was incidental, barely worth taking. What they wanted was something infinitely darker. They forced the brothers from the car at gunpoint, marching them into the scrubland where trees twisted into grotesque shapes and the ground was littered with garbage dumped by people who treated this area as Maracaibo's forgotten corner. There, under a sky obscured by industrial pollution, the Alvarez brothers learned that evil exists beyond anything theology or philosophy can adequately explain. Ismael and Jose separated the brothers, tying them to different trees about 30 meters apart, close enough that each could hear what was happening to the other, but too far to offer any help. This was a new refinement in their methodology. The psychological torture of knowing your brother, your blood, was suffering and dying while you remained helpless. They started with Santiago, the older brother. Jose beat him with methodical precision while Ismael made Pedro watch, shouting across the distance exactly what they were doing, describing each blow in clinical detail. Santiago's screams echoed through the scrubland, raw and primal, the sound of a human being reduced to his most basic response to overwhelming pain. When Santiago fell unconscious, they moved to Pedro. The younger brother begged, offering anything, everything, if they would just let him go, just let his brother live. His pleas dissolved into incoherent sobbing as José's fists and boots found their targets again and again, breaking ribs, rupturing organs, transforming a healthy young man into a bleeding ruin bound to a tree. They alternated between the brothers, reviving the unconscious one before moving back to torture the other, stretching the horror across hours. This was no longer about money or even about killing. This was about the absolute power they wielded, the godlike ability to control life and death, to dispense suffering or mercy according to their whims. Finally, as dawn approached and they needed to return to the city before their absence was noted, they killed both brothers. Santiago died from the cumulative trauma of the beating, his body simply shutting down from shock and blood loss. Pedro was stabbed repeatedly, the knife entering his body more than 30 times in a frenzy of violence that spoke to something beyond sadism, entering the realm of complete psychotic break. The Alvarez brothers were found by a farmer 2 days later, their bodies already bloating in the heat, surrounded by vultures that had gathered for the feast. The crime scene was so horrific, the violence so extreme, that even hardened investigators struggled to process what they were seeing. 2 young men, their lives ahead of them, destroyed for no reason beyond the entertainment of monsters who had learned to enjoy murder the way normal people enjoy a hobby. Still, the authorities failed to connect these killings to the others. The murders happened in different police jurisdictions, handled by different departments that rarely communicated. The bodies were in various states of decomposition, making forensic analysis difficult. Venezuela's struggling criminal justice system, overwhelmed by drug violence and political chaos, simply couldn't marshal the resources needed to recognize that a pattern was emerging. Victim 6 was Jorge Ramirez, a university student who had the misfortune of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Jorge was 22, studying engineering, trying to build a future in a country that seemed determined to destroy its young people's dreams. He was walking home from his girlfriend's apartment around 11 at night when Ismael and José spotted him. They approached him asking for directions, 2 ordinary-looking men with a city map who seemed lost. Jorge, polite and helpful by nature, stopped to assist. Within seconds, a knife was at his throat, and he was being forced into a car that had materialized from a side street. They took him to a different location this time, an abandoned house in a neighborhood that had been evacuated due to structural damage. Inside the house, surrounded by the detritus of lives interrupted, furniture left behind, children's toys scattered across floors, family photos still hanging on walls, they subjected Jorge to a nightmare that lasted until sunrise. The details of what happened to Jorge Ramirez are almost too disturbing to recount. The coroner's report documented over 150 individual injuries, each representing a separate act of deliberate cruelty. They had taken their time with him, exploring the limits of human endurance, discovering precisely how much damage a body could sustain before shutting down completely. Jorge's torture included burns, cuts, broken bones, and trauma from blunt force that left no part of his body undamaged. They had carved symbols into his chest, playing with him like children defacing property they don't value. His screams went unheard in that abandoned neighborhood, absorbed by empty houses where no one lived to care or call for help. When Jorge finally died from blood loss and shock, his body was left in the house like garbage. It would be found 3 days later by teenagers exploring the abandoned neighborhood, looking for a place to drink beer and smoke cigarettes. Those teenagers would spend years trying to forget what they saw, the image of Jorge's destroyed body seared into their memories forever. Victim 7 marked a shift in the killer's patterns. Whereas previous victims had been adults, Victim 7 was 16-year-old Luis Martinez, a street kid who lived hand-to-mouth, sleeping in doorways and surviving through a combination of petty theft and begging. Luis had no family, no one who would miss him, no one who would file a police report when he disappeared. Ismael and Jose had begun to understand that certain victims were safer, people whose absence wouldn't trigger investigations, who existed on society's margins where disappearance was common and largely ignored. Luis represented this category perfectly, and they selected him with the calculated precision of predators who had learned from experience. They lured him with the promise of food and money, offering him work helping them move furniture from an apartment. Luis, hungry and desperate, followed them willingly. What happened next, in yet another abandoned building that Maracaibo had forgotten, was perhaps their most depraved act yet. Luis was just a child, still gangly with adolescence, his body not yet filled into manhood. They showed him no mercy for his youth. If anything, his helplessness seemed to intensify their sadism. They tortured him for hours, extracting screams that held a particular pitch of terror only children can produce, that sound of innocence being violently ripped away. The boy begged for his mother, even though he'd been orphaned for years. He cried and pleaded in ways that would have moved anyone possessing even a fragment of human empathy. But Ismael and Jose were long past empathy. They had crossed into territory where other people weren't real, where suffering was entertainment, where death was sport. When they finished with Luis, they disposed of his body in a trash pile behind an industrial complex, throwing him away like the garbage they believed him to be. He was found by waste management workers the next morning, his small body bearing the evidence of what had been done to him, his dead eyes staring at nothing, reflecting the last horrible things he'd seen before darkness took him. 7 victims in 7 months. 7 people erased, their deaths marked by a level of brutality that suggested something deeply wrong was happening in Maracaibo. But still, the authorities didn't see the pattern. The murders remained isolated incidents, filed in different cabinets, investigated by different detectives who never compared notes. The killers, meanwhile, were becoming addicted to their work. What had started as occasional violence had become a compulsion. They needed to kill now the way addicts need their drug. The intervals between murders were growing shorter, the brutality intensifying. They were spiraling deeper into darkness, and there seemed to be no bottom. Maracaibo continued its daily routines, unaware that something unprecedented was hunting its citizens, something that would eventually force the city to confront uncomfortable truths about the society it had become. December 2003 brought no relief to Maracaibo, only escalation. Ismael Antonio Sanchez and Jose Rojas had evolved beyond ordinary criminals into something approaching serial killers in the truest sense. Predators who killed not for profit but for the satisfaction of killing itself. Their body count was climbing, their methods growing more savage, and their confidence soaring as they continued to operate without consequence. Victim 8 was discovered on December 14th, and this murder finally triggered the alarm that should have been sounded months earlier. The victim was Detective Rafael Contreras' nephew, 18-year-old Miguel Contreras, a bright student with university plans and a family that had resources and connections. When Miguel disappeared after leaving a friend's house, his uncle immediately mobilized resources that hadn't been available to previous victims' families. Ismael and Jose had selected Miguel randomly, spotting him waiting at a bus stop late in the evening. They had no idea they were grabbing the nephew of a police detective, no idea that this particular victim would be different from all the others. It was pure chance, the kind of unlucky coincidence that brings down criminals who've grown too confident in their invincibility. They took Miguel to their now-established killing ground, another abandoned building, this one in the industrial district where the screams of their victims mixed with the grinding sounds of nearby factories that ran night shifts. What they did to Miguel Contreras followed their established pattern. Prolonged torture, systematic brutality, and finally death delivered almost as an afterthought when they'd exhausted their entertainment. Miguel's body was discovered within 12 hours, found by his uncle's frantic search efforts. Detective Contreras, a 20-year veteran of Maracaibo's police force, stood over his nephew's ruined corpse and felt something inside him shatter and reform into something hard and determined. He had seen violence before. Venezuela's escalating crime rates ensured that, but this was different. This was personal, and this was excessive even by the standards of a city drowning in brutality. Contreras began pulling files, searching for similar cases. What he found in those dusty basement archives would transform the investigation and finally expose the truth that had been hiding in plain sight. Case after case, victim after victim, all sharing common elements. Extreme violence, prolonged torture, bodies left in abandoned locations, victims selected from vulnerable populations. Working around the clock, bypassing bureaucratic obstacles through sheer force of will and grief, Contreras built a case file that proved what the fragmented police departments had failed to recognize. A serial killer or killers were operating in Maracaibo, and they'd been active for at least 8 months, possibly longer. The media exploded with the story. Headlines screamed about monsters stalking the city, about police incompetence, about the breakdown of social order. Fear spread through Maracaibo like wildfire. Parents locked their children inside after dark. Street vendors and taxi drivers began working in groups for protection. The city that had been numbed by routine violence suddenly woke to the reality that something unprecedented was happening. The pressure on law enforcement became immense. Politicians demanded action. Families of the other victims, previously ignored, suddenly found their voices amplified by media attention. The investigation that had been scattered across multiple jurisdictions was consolidated under Detective Contreras' leadership, given resources that should have been available from the beginning. For Ismael and Jose, the changed atmosphere was palpable but not deterrent. They had tasted power that came from total domination over others, and they were addicted. If anything, the heightened alert made the hunt more exciting, the challenge more intoxicating. They continued killing even as police presence increased on the streets. Victim 9 was a taxi driver named Fernando Oviedo, 48 years old, a father of 5 who had survived the murder of Carlos Mendoza 8 months earlier. They'd been friends, had shared tips about dangerous areas and suspicious passengers. Fernando had been extra careful since his friend's death, but careful wasn't enough against predators who had refined their methods through repetition. They flagged him down on a busy street, Ismael presenting as a businessman needing transport to a meeting, Jose playing the role of assistant. Fernando, needing the fare, accepted despite his misgivings. They directed him toward an industrial area, and when he began to protest, suggesting an alternative route, Jose put a knife to his neck from the back seat, while Ismael calmly took the steering wheel. They drove Fernando to an abandoned warehouse district, forcing him from the car at knife point. Fernando tried to run despite the knife, his survival instinct overriding everything else, but Jose was younger and faster. He caught Fernando within 50 meters, tackling him to the oil-stained concrete, raining down blows that broke ribs and ruptured internal organs. What followed was hours of systematic torture that revealed just how far Ismael and Jose had descended into depravity. They used tools found in the warehouse, pipes, chains, electrical equipment, to inflict injuries that had no purpose beyond causing maximum suffering. Fernando's screams echoed through the empty industrial complex, unheard by anyone who might have helped. They killed him eventually, bored with his suffering, strangling him with his own belt while he gurgled and choked, his body too damaged to fight anymore. They left him in the warehouse, another message delivered, another life erased for their entertainment. Fernando's body was found the next day by a security guard making rounds. The discovery triggered immediate response from Detective Contreras' task force. For the first time, forensic teams properly processed the crime scene, collecting evidence that had been neglected at previous locations. They found fingerprints, DNA evidence, witnesses who had seen the taxi in the area. The investigation was finally functioning as it should have from the beginning. Contreras coordinated with federal authorities, brought in specialists, organized a proper task force with dedicated resources. The media pressure helped. Politicians couldn't ignore the crisis anymore, couldn't allow serial killers to operate with impunity while cameras rolled and reporters asked uncomfortable questions. Victim 10 came just 3 days later, marking the killer's most rapid escalation yet. Her name was Isabella Moreno, a 25-year-old nurse who worked night shifts at Maracaibo's public hospital. Isabella was engaged to be married, planning a wedding for the following summer, building a life that should have stretched decades into the future. She left the hospital at 2 in the morning, exhausted from a shift that had seen 3 gunshot victims and 2 knife wounds, the typical night in a city consuming itself with violence. The parking lot where hospital staff left their cars was poorly lit, isolated, a security vulnerability that everyone knew about but budget constraints prevented fixing. Ismael and Jose had been watching the hospital for weeks, identifying patterns, recognizing opportunity. They knew the shift changes, knew which nurses left alone, knew exactly where the security cameras had blind spots. When Isabella walked to her car, fumbling for keys in her bag, they moved with practiced efficiency. Jose grabbed her from behind, hand clamping over her mouth before she could scream. Ismael disabled her car's interior lights, opening the back door. Within seconds, Isabella was in her own vehicle, bound with duct tape, her car being driven away from the hospital by men who had done this too many times to make mistakes. They took her to a location they'd prepared specifically for this, a rented storage unit in a facility with minimal security and no overnight staff. Inside the unit, they had created a soundproofed space using foam and blankets, a place where they could take their time without worrying about being heard. What happened to Isabella Moreno in that storage unit over the next 8 hours represents the absolute nadir of human behavior. The autopsy would reveal torture so extensive, so systematic, that it suggested careful planning and deliberate pacing to keep the victim conscious and suffering as long as possible. They burned her with heated metal. They cut her systematically, creating wounds designed to be painful but not immediately fatal. They broke bones with deliberate precision. They did things to her that the coroner's report would describe in clinical language to maintain professional distance from the horror being documented. Isabella's screams, absorbed by the soundproofing, went unheard until it no longer mattered, until her voice gave out from overuse, until death finally came as a mercy long denied. They left her body in the storage unit, abandoning the location entirely, confident that by the time she was discovered, they would have moved on to whatever came next. But this time they had made mistakes. The storage facility had security cameras they hadn't noticed, positioned to capture the entrance gates. The rental had been done under a false name, but the process required identity documents that could be traced. For the first time in their killing spree, Ismael and Jose had left a trail that could be followed. Isabella's body was discovered 2 days later when the storage facility manager noticed the unpaid rent and suspicious smell coming from the unit. The crime scene was so disturbing that 2 of the responding officers had to be treated for trauma. Detective Contreras, hardened by months of investigating these murders, stood in that storage unit and felt his determination harden into something approaching obsession. The security footage was reviewed immediately. 2 men were captured on camera, their faces partially visible, their vehicle identifiable. The car was traced to a rental company. The false documents used to rent both the vehicle and the storage unit provided handwriting samples, fingerprints, connections that began forming a web around the killers. For the first time, the investigation had momentum. Contreras' task force began showing the security footage to informants, to other criminals, to anyone who might recognize the faces. In a city where everyone knew someone who knew someone else, word began to spread. The killer's anonymity, their greatest protection, was starting to crack. Meanwhile, Ismael and Jose felt invincible. 10 victims now, 10 people destroyed, and they walked freely through Maracaibo streets without consequence. The media attention amused them rather than worried them. They consumed news reports about their crimes with satisfaction, their egos swelling with each panicked headline, each interview with terrified citizens. They began taking greater risks, emboldened by what they perceived as their own genius and the authorities' incompetence. They selected victim 11 in broad daylight, a street vendor named Arturo Perez who sold fruit from a cart in a busy marketplace. They approached him as customers, engaging him in conversation while the crowd swirled around them, then followed him when he pushed his cart to a storage location at day's end. The attack happened in the storage room, a windowless space where Arturo kept his cart and unsold inventory overnight. They overpowered him quickly, the element of surprise negating any advantage his strength might have provided. They tortured him there, in that confined space that smelled of overripe fruit and wooden crates, muffling his screams with cloth. Arturo died hard, fighting until the very end, his survival instinct refusing to surrender even when his body was failing. They stabbed him repeatedly when he wouldn't stop struggling, frustrated by his resistance, angry that he wouldn't submit to their power the way previous victims had. They left his body among the fruit crates, blood soaking into the wooden floor, and walked out into the marketplace as ordinary citizens, invisible in the crowd. Arturo's body was discovered hours later when his wife came looking for him, worried when he didn't return home for dinner. This murder, happening in such a public location with so many potential witnesses, provided the breakthrough Contreras had been desperately seeking. Multiple people had seen two men talking with Arturo. The descriptions, when combined with the security footage from the storage facility, began to form a composite that could be circulated widely. Within 48 hours, informants began providing names. Jose Rojas was identified first. His prison record meant his photograph was already in the system, and multiple witnesses confirmed him as one of the men. Ismael Antonio Sanchez was identified shortly after through associates who knew he and Jose had been inseparable for months. The net was closing, but Ismael and Jose remained unaware, still drunk on their own perceived invincibility, already planning their next victim. January 2004 began with Maracaibo holding its collective breath. The investigation into the serial killings had finally coalesced around two suspects, Ismael Antonio Sanchez and Jose Rojas, but finding them proved challenging. They had gone to ground, aware somehow that the authorities were closing in, their survival instincts finally overriding their compulsion to kill. Detective Rafael Contreras had become the public face of the investigation, his personal tragedy lending him credibility and driving his relentless pursuit of his nephew's killers. He coordinated with federal authorities, with Interpol, with every law enforcement resource Venezuela could marshal. The manhunt intensified, with photographs of the suspects plastered across every media outlet, rewards offered for information leading to their capture. The city transformed into a place of locked doors and suspicious glances. Every stranger was a potential threat, every dark street a possible ambush site. The psychological impact of knowing that serial killers had operated freely for months, that the authorities had failed to protect their citizens, created a wound in Maracaibo's collective psyche that would take years to heal. Ismael and Jose, meanwhile, were experiencing their first taste of genuine fear. The anonymity that had protected them was gone, replaced by their faces on every television screen and newspaper front page. They couldn't return to their usual haunts, couldn't access the support networks that had sustained them. For the first time since they'd started killing, they were the prey instead of the predators. They holed up in a dilapidated apartment complex on the city's outskirts, a building so neglected by landlords and authorities that entire floors sat empty, squatted by people who had nowhere else to go. Here, among the desperate and invisible, they believed they could hide until the heat died down, until the city's attention moved to something else. But they couldn't stop. The compulsion that had driven them to kill 11 people hadn't disappeared just because capture was now a real possibility. If anything, the pressure intensified their need, transformed it into something even more desperate and dangerous. They were addicts facing withdrawal, and the only thing that could satisfy them was more death, more domination, more proof that they still held power even as the walls closed in. Victim 12 was another resident of the same apartment complex where they were hiding, a tragic irony that would later be dissected in countless psychological profiles of the killers. His name was Esteban Ruiz, a 53-year-old alcoholic who lived alone in a ground-floor unit, surviving on a small disability pension and whatever odd jobs he could manage between benders. Ismael and Jose encountered him in the building's communal courtyard late one evening, both drawn outside by the suffocating heat that turned their hiding place into an oven. Esteban was drunk, rambling about his former life as a factory worker before the injury that had ended his career and started his descent into alcoholism. They engaged him in conversation, sharing the bottle of cheap rum he'd been drinking from. To any observer, they looked like three marginalized men finding temporary companionship in shared misery. But Ismael and Jose were already planning, already calculating, their predatory instincts activated by opportunity. They followed Esteban back to his apartment when he stumbled toward it hours later, offering to help him navigate the stairs he could barely manage in his intoxicated state. Once inside, with the door closed and locked behind them, the mask dropped and the monsters emerged. What happened to Esteban Ruiz in that apartment was rushed compared to their previous murders. They were operating under constraints now, aware that any noise might draw attention from residents who might actually recognize them. But rushed didn't mean less brutal. They beat him savagely, using their fists and whatever objects came to hand, driven by frustration and anger at their circumstances. Esteban's apartment became an abattoir, blood splattered across walls that had already seen too much neglect and despair. They strangled him finally with the power cord from his television, watching his face turn purple then gray as life fled, experiencing that familiar rush of power that temporarily satisfied the hunger gnawing at them. They left his body where it fell and returned to their own hiding place, wiping blood from their hands with his own towels, feeling temporarily satiated but knowing the hunger would return soon, always sooner than before. Esteban's body wasn't discovered for 3 days, in a building where people minded their own business and the smell of death competed with a dozen other unpleasant odors. His absence went unnoticed. When a social worker finally found him during a welfare check, the crime scene had degraded significantly, but the brutality was still evident. The murder triggered a massive police presence at the apartment complex. Contreras, viewing crime scene photographs, immediately recognized the signature elements of the serial killers he'd been hunting. The realization that Ismael and Jose might be hiding in this very building energized the investigation. Every apartment was searched, every resident questioned. Witnesses came forward describing 2 men matching the suspects' descriptions. Men who kept to themselves, who had been seen in the courtyard the night Esteban was likely killed. The net was tightening with suffocating precision. But Ismael and Jose had already fled the building, warned by an instinct for survival that had kept them alive through decades of criminal activity. They stole a car, their third in as many weeks, and drove north toward the border with Zulia State, hoping to disappear into rural communities where police presence was minimal and questions were rare. They made it 50 kilometers before the stolen car's engine overheated on a desolate highway cutting through scrubland. Stranded, angry, their careful plans collapsing into chaos, they found themselves on foot in oppressive heat with nowhere to hide. A truck driver named Hector Soto saw them walking along the highway shoulder and, moved by compassion that would cost him everything, stopped to offer assistance. Hector was 62, a grandfather who'd been driving trucks for 40 years, who had a reputation for helping stranded travelers because he believed in human decency, in doing for others what he hoped someone would do for his own family if they were in need. Ismael and Jose accepted the ride with fake gratitude, climbing into Hector's truck cabin with backpacks containing their few possessions and the weapons they'd kept through everything. Hector asked no questions about why they were walking, simply shared his water and talked about his grandchildren, about the loads he transported, about the routes he knew better than his own neighborhood. They killed him 20 kilometers down the road, unable to resist the opportunity, unable to fight the compulsion even though killing the man who'd helped them served no strategic purpose. Jose struck first, a knife driven into Hector's side while he was focused on driving. The truck swerved violently, tires screaming, before Ismael grabbed the wheel and forced it onto the shoulder. Hector died slowly in the driver's seat of his truck, bleeding out while pleading for an explanation, trying to understand why the men he'd helped were destroying him. They offered no answers because there were none that would make sense to someone who lived in a moral universe. They simply watched him die, experiencing the familiar satisfaction, before dragging his body into the scrubland and driving off in his truck. Hector Soto's murder, their 13th confirmed victim, would be their last. The truck driver's family reported him missing when he failed to return from his route. His truck was spotted by highway patrol later that day, the stolen vehicle report having been circulated widely. When officers attempted to pull it over, Ismael made the fatal decision to run. The chase that followed was brief but dramatic, ending when Jose, attempting to navigate a sharp curve at excessive speed, lost control. The truck rolled multiple times, metal crumpling and glass shattering, before coming to rest on its side in a drainage ditch. Jose died in the crash, his neck broken by the impact, his body trapped in the twisted wreckage. Ismael survived, though severely injured, fractured ribs, a broken arm, internal bleeding that would require surgery. He was conscious when officers pulled him from the wreckage, aware enough to realize that his freedom, his power, his ability to hurt people without consequence had ended in a drainage ditch on a highway outside Maracaibo. The arrest made international news. The monster of Maracaibo had finally been caught, though one of the killers had died before facing justice. Ismael Antonio Sanchez was transported to a hospital under heavy guard, then to a maximum security prison once doctors stabilized his condition. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of their crimes. Ismail offered reduced charges in exchange for cooperation, confessed to 13 murders, though investigators suspected the actual number was higher. He led police to locations where bodies might still be undiscovered, showed them the abandoned buildings and storage units where they'd tortured their victims, provided details that only someone who'd been present could know. The confessions were delivered in a flat, emotionless tone that disturbed everyone who heard them. Ismail showed no remorse, no understanding that he'd done anything wrong beyond getting caught. When asked why they'd killed, he shrugged and said they enjoyed it, as if that simple statement explained everything. The trial began in June 2004 and lasted 3 months. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence: forensic connections, witness testimonies, Ismail's own confessions, crime scene photographs that had to be shown in closed court due to their graphic nature. The defense attempted to argue diminished capacity, suggesting that Ismail suffered from mental illness that prevented him from understanding his actions. The argument failed. Expert witnesses testified that while Ismail likely had antisocial personality disorder, he understood perfectly well that what he was doing was wrong. He simply didn't care. The planning, the victim selection, the efforts to avoid detection all demonstrated rational thought and awareness of consequences. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all 13 counts of first-degree murder, plus numerous additional charges including kidnapping, torture, robbery, and sexual assault. The judge, in sentencing Ismail to 13 consecutive life terms with no possibility of parole, spoke directly to him. "You have demonstrated yourself to be beyond rehabilitation, beyond redemption. You will spend whatever remains of your life in a cage, where you can no longer hurt anyone. That is more mercy than you showed any of your victims." Ismail listened without expression, then was led away to begin a sentence that would keep him imprisoned until death. He would spend his remaining years in isolation, deemed too dangerous to interact with the general prison population, his days measured in the unchanging routine of meals delivered through a slot and 1 hour of solitary exercise in a concrete yard. The aftermath of the case rippled through Maracaibo for years. Families of the victims received some closure, though closure is inadequate compensation for irreplaceable loss. Detective Contreras, who had become obsessed with catching his nephew's killers, retired shortly after the trial, unable to continue in a job that had cost him so much personally. The city itself was forced to confront uncomfortable questions about the society that had allowed such monsters to operate for so long. How had the police missed the patterns? Why were certain victims' deaths investigated less thoroughly than others? What did it say about Venezuela that marginalized people could disappear without triggering serious response? Reform efforts began. Better coordination between police jurisdictions, improved forensic capabilities, more resources for cold cases. But systemic change is slow, and Venezuela's deepening economic and political crisis made sustained improvement difficult. The victims were finally properly memorialized. A monument was erected in central Maracaibo listing their names: Carlos Mendoza, Ricardo Fuentes, Maria Elena Torres, Santiago and Pedro Alvarez, Jorge Ramirez, Luis Martinez, Miguel Contreras, Fernando Oviedo, Isabela Moreno, Arturo Perez, Esteban Ruiz, and Hector Soto, 13 people who had committed no crime beyond being vulnerable at the wrong moment, whose deaths should never have happened, who deserved the long lives that were stolen from them. The psychological impact on survivors, families, friends, the officers who investigated, the prosecutors who tried the case, would persist for decades. Post-traumatic stress, depression, anxiety disorders, and substance abuse problems plagued many who had been touched by these crimes. The horror of what Ismael and Jose had done created concentric circles of trauma spreading outward from each victim. As years passed, the case became a subject of academic study. Criminologists analyzed the killer's methods, psychologists dissected their motivations, and sociologists examined the societal conditions that had enabled their crimes. Books were written, documentaries produced, graduate theses defended on the topic of serial killers in developing nations with weak law enforcement infrastructure. Ismael Antonio Sanchez gave occasional interviews from prison, always seeking attention, always trying to reclaim some of the power he'd once wielded. He showed no remorse in these interviews, instead displaying a chilling pride in what he'd accomplished. He died in prison in 2019, suffering a heart attack at age 48. His passing noted in a brief news article that reopened wounds for victims' families who'd been trying to move forward. Jose Rojas had no grave, his body cremated and ashes disposed of without ceremony. He remained a cipher even in death. Investigators never fully understood what drove him, what had broken inside him that allowed such violence to flourish. The case of Ismael Antonio Sanchez and Jose Rojas stands as one of Venezuela's most horrific criminal episodes, a reminder that evil exists not in the supernatural but in the human capacity for cruelty when empathy dies and moral constraints collapse. Their victims are remembered not for how they died but for how they lived. As parents and children, workers and students, people with dreams and plans that should have extended decades into futures that were stolen from them by monsters who walked among us wearing human faces. Maracaibo eventually recovered, as cities do, though the scars remained. The abandoned buildings where so much horror occurred were demolished or renovated, transformed into something new that couldn't hold ghosts. But memory persists, passed down through families and recorded in archives, ensuring that 13 people who died in agony are not forgotten, and that the evil that destroyed them is remembered as a warning about the darkness lurking in the human heart when civilization's thin veneer cracks and monsters are allowed to emerge from the shadows where they've always been waiting. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and subscribe, so you never miss the next true crime story to help you unwind. Now, let's get into our final story. Story 4. The Tambor Killer. Some monsters wear human faces and wait patiently for the system to set them free. When a killer confesses on television that he might murder again, believe him. They gave him a second chance. He took a second life, then a third, then confessed to more hidden in the earth, waiting to be discovered. Hugo Bustamante didn't just break the law. He shattered the illusion that justice could contain evil. This is the story of the man they called the Tambor Killer, a predator who turned parole into a hunting license, who buried his victims like secrets, and who proved that sometimes the most dangerous place for the innocent is right next to someone the system deemed reformed. What you're about to hear will disturb you. It should, because every word of it is true. The coastal city of Quilpue, Chile, seemed ordinary enough on March 28, 1965, when Hugo Humberto Bustamante Perez entered the world. But nothing about his arrival suggested the darkness he would bring. Second of 4 children, Hugo's childhood home was less a sanctuary and more a battlefield where violence wore the mask of family. His parents' relationship was soaked in alcohol and punctuated with fists. The walls absorbed screams, the floors knew blood, and young Hugo learned early that cruelty wasn't just possible, it was normal. By 11 years old, the boy had already begun his descent. His mother, drowning in her own demons, hosted parties where substances flowed freely and boundaries dissolved entirely. Hugo didn't just witness this chaos. He consumed it. Pills, powders, anything that could blur the edges of reality became his companions. The discipline that might have anchored him crumbled like sand castles before a tide. School became irrelevant. Authority became a joke. And the darkness inside him found room to grow, spreading through his veins like poison through water. As Hugo aged, his appetites grew hungrier. Money became an obsession, but not the kind earned through honest labor. No, Hugo wanted quick cash for specific purposes. Prostitutes, drugs, and alcohol formed the trinity of his desires. His life became a cycle of petty crimes funding temporary pleasures, each transgression making the next one easier, each boundary crossed making the next one invisible. The poverty wasn't just financial, it was moral, spiritual, a complete bankruptcy of human decency. By his early 20s, Hugo had fathered 2 daughters. But fatherhood didn't soften him. Couldn't. The capacity for genuine love, for selfless care, for putting another human being first, these qualities either never developed in Hugo or had been beaten out of him long ago. His daughters were facts of his existence, not reasons to change. The criminal record began accumulating like layers of sediment. Robbery with violence, drug trafficking, assault. Each arrest was a warning sign. Each release was another chance he didn't deserve and wouldn't use wisely. The year 1996 brought crimes that Hugo would keep hidden for decades. Elena Hinojosa and Eduardo Paez, two names that would only surface years later when Hugo decided to unburden himself from his prison cell. Their bodies, wherever they were hidden, remained silent testimony to murders that went unreported, uninvestigated, unavenged. How did he do it? Where did he hide them? These questions would haunt investigators when Hugo finally confessed, speaking casually about ending lives as though discussing the weather. But in 1996, these deaths were just missing persons, maybe runaways, maybe tragic accidents. Nobody suspected the truth lurking in Villa Alemana. The years between 1996 and 2005 remain partially obscured, a dark period where Hugo moved through society like a shark through murky water. He worked occasional jobs, maintaining a facade of normalcy that fooled enough people enough of the time. He had relationships, including one with Veronica Vasquez Puebla, a woman with a young son named Eugenio Honorado Vasquez. To outsiders, they might have seemed like any struggling couple trying to make it work. But behind closed doors, Hugo's true nature festered and grew. Veronica didn't know she was living with a killer. How could she? Hugo had perfected the art of presenting one face to the world while concealing another entirely. He could be charming when it suited him, functional when necessary, normal enough to avoid suspicion. But underneath, the violence was always there, coiled tight, waiting for the right moment to strike. And that moment was approaching fast. January 2005 marked the breaking point. Financial pressures mounted, and Hugo demanded money from Veronica. Money she simply didn't have. The argument that followed wasn't just heated. It was fatal. On January 8th, in their home, Hugo's hands found Veronica's throat. He squeezed. She struggled, fighting for air, for life, for her son who would need her. But Hugo didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Or more accurately, he wouldn't stop. He kept squeezing until Veronica's body went limp, until the woman who had trusted him lay dead at his feet. 9-year-old Eugenio witnessed this horror. The boy tried desperately to save his mother, pulling at Hugo, screaming, doing everything a terrified child could do against a grown man intent on murder. But Eugenio's courage only sealed his fate. Hugo turned on the boy, those same hands that had just strangled Veronica now wrapping around Eugenio's small neck. The child fought. God, how he must have fought. But children don't win against monsters, especially monsters without mercy or remorse. 2 bodies now lay in Hugo's home. Most people would panic, call for help, flee. But Hugo Bustamante wasn't most people. His mind worked differently, calculating and cold. He looked at the corpses and saw a problem requiring a solution. That solution came in the form of a large metal drum, 200 liters capacity, the kind used for storing water. Hugo forced both bodies into this container, bending limbs, compressing flesh, treating human remains like garbage to be concealed. But Hugo wasn't finished. He added water, then lime, then plaster, creating a macabre mixture designed to accelerate decomposition, to destroy evidence, to make Veronica and Eugenio disappear as thoroughly as possible. The drum became a tomb, sealed and ready for burial. On January 15th, Hugo transported this container to his new residence within the same commune. Neighbors who saw him moving might have waved, helped him carry boxes, wished him well in his new place. None of them knew they were watching a killer relocate his victims. For 10 days, Hugo's secret remained hidden. But death has a way of announcing itself. The smell began creeping from Hugo's property, subtle at first, then undeniable, the sweet, rotten stench of decomposing flesh. Neighbors noticed. Someone called the investigative police of Villa Alemana. On January 25th, officers arrived at Hugo's home, following their noses to the backyard where that drum sat like a monument to evil. When investigators opened the container, the horror was complete. 2 bodies, partially decomposed, mixed with lime and plaster, compressed together in a space meant for water, not people. Veronica and Eugenio had been found, but far too late. Their last moments had been terror and pain. Their final resting place had been indignity and darkness. And the man responsible stood nearby, caught red-handed with evidence too overwhelming to deny. Hugo Bustamante was arrested on the spot. The evidence was conclusive, the crime undeniable. He faced trial for double homicide, and the details that emerged painted a picture of a man utterly devoid of human empathy. He had killed his partner over money. He had murdered a 9-year-old boy for trying to save his mother. And he had disposed of their bodies with all the emotional weight of taking out the trash. Chile watched in horror as the case unfolded, and Hugo earned his nickname, El Asesino del Tambor. The tambor killer, the drum killer, the man who buried bodies in barrels. The trial concluded with a conviction. Hugo Bustamante was sentenced to 27 years in prison for the double homicide. 27 years seemed like justice. It seemed like society was protected. The monster was caged, and 2 innocent victims could rest knowing their killer would spend decades behind bars. But that sentence, those 27 years, would prove to be one of the most catastrophic failures in Chilean judicial history. Because Hugo Bustamante wasn't done killing. Not even close. Prison was supposed to reform Hugo Bustamante. The steel bars, the concrete walls, the years stretching ahead, all of it was meant to transform a killer into something resembling a human being. But you can't rehabilitate something that was never habilitated to begin with. Hugo adapted to prison life the way a virus adapts to a new host. Efficiently, without conscience, maintaining just enough functionality to survive. 11 years into his sentence, something remarkable happened. Not remarkable in a good way, but remarkable in its perfect encapsulation of systemic failure. Hugo Bustamante, the man who had strangled 2 people and stuffed their bodies in a drum, became eligible for parole. The year was 2016, and Chilean law had created a pathway for prisoners who met certain objective criteria to apply for conditional liberty. The process seemed straightforward enough on paper. Inmates who maintained good conduct and served half their sentence could be considered for release. It was meant to reward rehabilitation, to incentivize positive behavior, to give reformed criminals a second chance at life. But the law had a fatal flaw. It treated good behavior in prison as equivalent to being safe for society. It assumed that following rules inside a cage meant you wouldn't harm people outside it. And in Hugo's case, that assumption would cost a life. Gendarmeria de Chile, the prison authority, compiled a list of inmates eligible for parole. Hugo Bustamante's name appeared on that list. But there was more to the story. Gendarmeria also prepared a report, a psychological and behavioral assessment that painted a very different picture. The report was negative. It recommended against releasing Hugo, highlighting concerns about his lack of genuine remorse, his superficial compliance, the absence of true rehabilitation. The professionals who worked directly with Hugo could see what he really was. But when the Parole Commission of the Valparaiso Court of Appeals reviewed Hugo's case in April 2016, they faced a decision. Before them sat objective criteria. Half the sentence served, check. Good conduct record, check. The negative report from Gendarmeria was noted but not binding. The judges discussed Hugo's case, and according to later testimony, at least one judge expressed hesitation. The Tambor murder case had been so notorious, so viscerally horrifying, that it gave pause even to hardened legal professionals. Yet the law was the law. The judges believed they had to follow it, regardless of their personal reservations. In a decision that would haunt them for years, the Parole Commission granted Hugo Bustamante conditional liberty. He was released alongside 789 other inmates, all supposedly vetted, all supposedly reformed, all supposedly safe to return to society. Hugo walked out of prison on a Tuesday afternoon, carrying his few possessions, stepping into sunlight he hadn't felt without bars for over a decade. But before Hugo disappeared into his new life, something extraordinary happened. Extraordinary and terrifying in retrospect. The television program Mea Culpa, hosted by journalist Carlos Pinto, had covered Hugo's case back in 2006, shortly after his arrest. The show specialized in crime stories, giving voice to victims and sometimes to perpetrators. In 2006, Carlos Pinto sat across from Hugo Bustamante in prison and asked him questions that now seemed prophetic. The interview was chilling. Hugo spoke about his crimes with an unsettling flatness, describing the murders of Veronica and Eugenio without apparent emotion. He detailed how he killed them, how he disposed of their bodies, all delivered in a tone more suited to discussing grocery shopping than ending human lives. But the most disturbing moment came when Carlos Pinto asked a specific question, one that Hugo himself brought up years later from his prison cell. "If you were released," Carlos Pinto asked, leaning forward, his eyes locked on Hugo's, "could you commit the same crime again?" The question hung in the air. Most people, even guilty people, would immediately say no. They'd offer reassurances, promises of change, declarations of remorse. But Hugo Bustamante wasn't most people. He paused, considering the question with the same casualness someone might consider whether to have coffee or tea. Then he answered, and his words should have been carved into stone as a warning. "I've thought about that," Hugo said, his face betraying nothing. "I've asked myself that question, and honestly, I don't have an answer. I couldn't tell you. No, it's impossible that I would experience a similar situation again." Read those words again. A man convicted of double homicide, a man who strangled his partner and murdered her 9-year-old son, openly admitted on national television that he could not guarantee he wouldn't kill again. He wasn't saying he would definitely reoffend, but he wasn't saying he wouldn't either. He was leaving the door open, acknowledging that under the right circumstances, with the right pressures, the monster inside him might wake up hungry. That interview aired years before Hugo's parole. It was public record. Anyone reviewing his case could have watched it. The judges deciding his conditional liberty could have considered those words, that confession of potential future violence. But apparently it didn't matter enough. The legal criteria were met, the bureaucratic boxes were checked, and Hugo Bustamante walked free despite literally telling the world he might kill again. The conditions of Hugo's parole were standard. Report regularly to authorities, maintain employment or show effort to find work, avoid criminal activity, basically be a functioning member of society. Hugo complied, at least initially. He found a place to live, checked in when required, kept his head down. To the parole system, he was a success story, proof that conditional liberty could work. But Hugo's compliance masked something sinister. During his time in prison and after his release, he developed relationships, including one with a woman named Denise Llanos. Denise had 2 children from previous relationships, a son and a daughter named Amber Cornejo. Amber was a teenager, vulnerable and dealing with her own complicated family situation. She would eventually come to live near her mother and Hugo, though she wisely chose to stay with her aunt rather than in the same house as her mother's boyfriend. Hugo also had a daughter from an earlier relationship, and she would later speak publicly about her father, about the shame and horror of bearing his name. "My father didn't deserve to be free," she would tell reporters after the events that were coming. She understood what the parole commission apparently couldn't, that some people aren't capable of reform, that some evil is fundamental rather than circumstantial. The years between 2016 and 2020 were a ticking clock. Hugo moved through Villa Alemana like a predator conserving energy before the hunt. He worked occasional jobs, maintained his relationship with Denise, and presented himself as reformed. But behind that facade, the same darkness that had consumed Veronica and Eugenio was still there, patient and hungry. And Hugo had developed another habit during this time, one that would prove crucial in understanding what came next. He spent time on the internet, searching for information that most people would never think to look up. His browser history would later reveal searches about torture techniques, both physical and psychological. He researched drugs like scopolamine, known on the street as burundanga, substances that could incapacitate victims and make them compliant. He was planning something, preparing, gathering knowledge for purposes that couldn't be innocent. By July 2020, Chile was deep in COVID-19 lockdown. The pandemic had isolated everyone, creating perfect conditions for violence to occur behind closed doors without witnesses. Amber Cornejo was 16 years old, living with her aunt in Villa Alemana, trying to navigate adolescence in extraordinary times. Her relationship with her mother, Denise, was complicated and fraught, marked by abandonment and reconciliation, by hope and disappointment. Every month, Amber's father, who lived in Antofagasta, sent money for his daughter's care, pension alimenticia, child support. Denise held this money, and Amber would collect it monthly. It was a routine transaction, a moment of contact between mother and daughter, nothing that should have ended in tragedy. But Hugo Bustamante was watching, waiting, and on July 29, 2020, the monster that Carlos Pinto had warned about woke up hungry. The stage was set. The victim was identified, and the man who admitted he might kill again was about to prove he hadn't been lying. Wednesday, July 29, 2020, started like any other day in Villa Alemana. The pandemic kept most people indoors, the streets quieter than usual, the normal rhythms of life muted by COVID restrictions. Amber Cornejo woke up in her aunt's house on Calle Covadonga, preparing for a simple errand that should have taken minutes. Her mother, Denise Llanos, had called asking her to come collect the monthly support money from her father. The distance between the houses was negligible, just a few blocks, a walk Amber could do with her eyes closed. At approximately 9 in the morning, Amber left her aunt's home. She was wearing casual clothes, carrying her phone, walking a familiar route through a neighborhood she knew well. The walk to her mother's house should have taken less than 10 minutes. Family members watched her go, expecting her back within the hour. But Amber Cornejo never came back. She vanished somewhere in that short distance, swallowed by an evil that had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. When Amber didn't return by mid-morning, her aunt grew concerned. By afternoon, concern became alarm. Phone calls went unanswered. Text messages remained unread. The family contacted Denise, asking if Amber was still there. According to Denise's initial statement, Amber had collected the money and left. But that didn't make sense. Where would she go? Why wouldn't she return home or at least answer her phone? By evening, the family contacted authorities. The investigative police of Chile, PDI, took the report seriously, especially given Amber's age and the unusual circumstances. A 16-year-old girl doesn't just vanish in broad daylight walking between family homes in a residential neighborhood. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, and the clock was already ticking. The PDI launched an immediate investigation. Detectives interviewed family members, friends, anyone who might know where Amber had gone. They traced her expected route, checking with neighbors, examining security cameras, searching for any clue about what had happened. The investigative machinery moved into action, but every hour that passed reduced the likelihood of finding Amber alive. Statistics about missing persons are grim. The first 48 hours are critical, and those hours were bleeding away. Marcos Quiñones, head of the Criminal Investigation Brigade, coordinated the search efforts. We're conducting interviews with the complainant and all involved persons, taking censuses of residents, examining locations related to the case, working with our criminalistics laboratory, he told the press on August 3rd, for days after Amber's disappearance. But behind his professional demeanor, investigators were following leads that pointed in a disturbing direction. Hugo Bustamante's name came up immediately. He lived with Denise, Amber's mother. He was present at the house Amber had been going to, and his history, that horrific double murder, that drum filled with bodies, made him an obvious person of interest. But being suspicious and having evidence are two different things. The PDI needed to build a case, gather proof, proceed carefully to ensure any arrest would stick. By August 4th, the search intensified. Governor Carolina Corti of Marga province described the efforts. We've deployed drones to map the complete route from where the girl left to where she was going, and we've calculated travel times. The technology painted a picture of Amber's expected movements, but technology couldn't answer the crucial question. Where was she now? Villa Alemana united in grief and concern. Neighbors who had never met Amber joined search parties. Posters appeared on every corner. Help us find Amber Cornejo Llanos, missing in Villa Alemana, Valparaiso region, since July 29, 2020. Any information is valuable. Her photo stared out from these posters. A young woman with her whole life ahead of her, now possibly fighting for her life, possibly already dead. On August 2nd, a vigil was held in Penablanca Plaza. Dozens of people gathered with candles, holding signs that read, "We're not all here, we're missing Amber," and "We're waiting for you, Amber." The community refused to give up hope, even as that hope grew dimmer with each passing day. Similar gatherings happened throughout the week, people united in desperation, praying for a miracle that wasn't coming. Behind the scenes, investigators were closing in. They examined phone records, financial transactions, witness statements. They looked at Hugo's history, his patterns, his psychology, and they found something chilling. 10 days before Amber's disappearance, Hugo had been searching the internet for information about torture, specifically physical and psychological torture techniques. He had also searched for information about scopolamine, a drug that could incapacitate victims. This wasn't spontaneous violence. This was premeditated, planned, researched. The evidence pointed inexorably toward Hugo Bustamante and potentially toward Denise Llanos as well. But where was Amber? If they had her, if she was still alive somewhere, time was critical. If she was already dead, finding her body was essential for justice. The investigators needed to act, but they also needed to be certain. A false move could compromise the entire case. In the early morning hours of Thursday, August 6th, 8 days after Amber vanished, the PDI executed their operation. Officers arrived at the home Hugo Bustamante shared with Denise Llanos. Both were detained immediately. The house itself became a crime scene, cordoned off with yellow tape while forensic teams began their meticulous work. Detective Sergio Espinoza led the search team. They examined every room, every closet, every potential hiding spot. They checked the attic, the basement, under floorboards, and then they turned their attention to the backyard, that patch of earth behind the house where neighbors had reported an unusual smell in recent days. A sweet, rotten odor that some recognized as death. The forensic team brought specialized equipment, ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs, excavation tools. They worked methodically, aware that the entire nation was watching, that a family was desperate for answers. And then, in the patio area, buried beneath the earth, they found something that confirmed their worst fears. In the backyard, inside the property, buried in coolers, we found skeletal remains. Detective Espinoza reported to the press, his voice steady but his face grim. The body is almost complete, along with clothing that indicates this would be the missing minor, Amber Cornejo, 16 years old. The words hit like a physical blow. Amber wasn't missing anymore. She was dead, murdered, dismembered, and buried like garbage in the backyard of her mother's house. The coolers, multiple coolers containing parts of a teenager who should have been planning for college, dating, living, were excavated carefully, each piece of evidence photographed and cataloged. The horror of what had happened to Amber Cornejo was only beginning to emerge. Prosecutor Maria Jose Bowen, who headed the case for the Villa Alemana district, held a press conference that same day. We followed various leads, multiple investigative lines. We didn't discount anything, and today we managed to find Amber's body, she said, maintaining professional composure while delivering devastating news. But then she revealed something even more shocking. The mother informed us about what the defendant told her. She gave a statement after being read her rights and stated that it was the defendant Bustamante who killed Amber. Denise Llanos, Amber's own mother, was telling investigators that Hugo Bustamante had murdered her daughter. But as the investigation progressed, a darker picture would emerge about Denise's own role in the crime. For now, though, the focus was on the horror of what had been found. A 16-year-old girl, dead, dismembered, buried in a backyard while the world searched for her. The autopsy would later reveal the full extent of Amber's suffering. She had been sexually assaulted, raped before being killed. The cause of death was asphyxiation, specifically mechanical asphyxia from obstruction of her nasal passages. Someone had smothered her, held her down, blocked her airways until she couldn't breathe anymore. And before that, she had been beaten, tortured using techniques Hugo had researched online. Amber's last hours had been unimaginable agony at the hands of someone who should have been in prison for life. The forensic examination also revealed that after killing Amber, Hugo and Denise had dismembered her body, cutting a young woman into pieces, separating limbs from torso, treating human remains with a callousness that defied comprehension. They had then buried these remains in their own backyard, covering them with earth, going about their daily lives while Amber decomposed meters from where they slept and ate. On August 10th, just 4 days after her body was discovered, Amber Cornejo was formally charged. Hugo Bustamante was formalized for the crimes of rape with femicide and illegal burial. He was remanded to preventive detention pending trial. The prosecutor announced they would seek the maximum penalty. Presidio perpetuo calificado, qualified life imprisonment, meaning at least 40 years without possibility of parole. Denise Llanos was initially released, treated as a witness rather than a co-conspirator. But investigators weren't satisfied with her story. Her behavior during and after Amber's disappearance raised serious questions. Why had she been seen walking with Hugo, searching for campsites, acting as though nothing was wrong? Why had her statement about Amber leaving the house contradicted other evidence? What exactly was Denise's role in her own daughter's murder? As investigators dug deeper, a horrifying truth emerged. Denise wasn't just a witness. She was an active participant. Evidence suggested she had helped lure Amber to the house, had been present during at least part of the torture and murder, and had actively assisted in dismembering and burying the body. A mother had helped kill her own daughter, participating in sexual abuse, torture, and murder for reasons that remain incomprehensible. Villa Alemana reeled from the revelations. On August 2nd, hundreds of people lined the streets for Amber's funeral procession. Purple balloons, the color associated with violence against women, filled the air. Signs demanding justice covered every surface. The National Women's Service and feminist organizations led chants, "And I una menos," not one less, not one more woman dead. A spokesperson for the Justice for Amber group addressed the crowd. "We're here to say goodbye to our little angel, our girl Amber, who we waited for so long. We want to make clear that this doesn't end here. Our organization will continue forward, and we want more women to join our fight. We want more women in the streets, men too, mothers with their children, not afraid to join this struggle." But even as Amber was laid to rest, even as a nation mourned, questions multiplied. How had Hugo Bustamante been released? Why hadn't the system prevented this? Was anyone accountable for the decision to grant him parole? And most importantly, could this murder have been prevented? The aftermath of Amber Cornejo's murder unleashed a firestorm across Chile. Citizens demanded answers. How had a convicted double murderer, a man who strangled his partner and her 9-year-old son, walked free after just 11 years? Why had his release been approved despite negative reports from prison authorities? Who was responsible for this catastrophic failure that cost a 16-year-old girl her life? President Sebastián Pinera addressed the nation via Twitter. The murder of Amber tore at the hearts of millions of Chileans. For her and for everyone, we have strengthened the conditional liberty law that would have prevented this murder, and we're advancing improvements in the prison system and sentence execution. This is the path of justice. No more impunity. But words rang hollow when a girl was dead and buried in a backyard. The public wanted accountability, not promises. A group of deputies from the Chilean Chamber of Deputies took action, filing a constitutional accusation against Gloria Ana Chavesic, the Supreme Court justice who had coordinated the parole commission that released Bustamante in 2016. The accusation charged notable abandonment of duties, arguing that Chavesic and her colleagues had ignored warning signs and prioritized legal technicalities over public safety. The process was contentious and partisan. Chavesic defended herself vigorously, arguing that the commission had followed the law as written. "We respect the attributions of parliamentarians, but we believe that in this case, notable abandonment of duties has not been established," she stated publicly. She pointed out that Chilean law at the time made parole essentially automatic for prisoners who met objective criteria. The commission had reviewed 790 cases and granted parole to all who qualified under the law. The judges who decided Bustamante's case later testified about their deliberations. They remembered pausing when they saw his name, recognizing the notorious Tambor murder case. One judge asked the others if they were certain about releasing him. But ultimately, they concluded they had to apply the law consistently. If an inmate had served half their sentence and maintained good conduct, the law required granting parole, regardless of the crime or any subjective concerns about future danger. This revealed a fundamental flaw in Chile's criminal justice system. The law treated prison behavior as an accurate predictor of post-release behavior. It assumed that someone who followed rules in a controlled environment would continue following rules in society. It prioritized punishment completion over public safety, and it gave judges no discretion to deny parole based on professional assessments of danger. The Chamber of Deputies voted on the accusation against Shevesic. With 73 votes in favor, 52 against, and 14 abstentions, the measure advanced to the Senate. But ultimately, the Senate would reject the accusation, determining that Shevesic had indeed followed the law, even if the result was tragic. The failure wasn't individual, it was systemic. The law itself was broken, and Amber Cornejo paid the price. Meanwhile, Hugo Bustamante's trial proceeded. The evidence was overwhelming, the case airtight. Forensic analysis, witness testimony, physical evidence, Hugo's own internet searches. Everything pointed to premeditated murder, sexual assault, torture, and attempted concealment. The prosecution, led by Maria Jose Bowen, built a meticulous case piece by piece. The trial began on October 26, 2021, at the Oral Criminal Court of Vina del March. The panel of judges, Manuel Muñoz Chamorro, Rocio Oscariz Calarte, and Monica Lopez Castillo, presided over proceedings that shocked even seasoned legal professionals. The details that emerged during testimony painted a picture of such depravity that reporters struggled to convey it appropriately. One particularly disturbing moment occurred during the trial's first session. Denise Llanos, now formally charged as a co-conspirator rather than a witness, was caught listening to music through earphones. Family members recognized the songs. They were Amber's favorite music. Denise's own mother was playing their murdered daughter's favorite songs during her murder trial. The provocation was so blatant, so cruel, that it sparked immediate outrage in the courtroom and beyond. The trial revealed the full extent of what happened on July 29, 2020. Hugo had planned the murder carefully, researching techniques, preparing materials, waiting for the right opportunity. When Denise called Amber to collect her support money, it was a trap. Amber arrived at the house expecting a routine transaction. Instead, she found Hugo waiting, ready to execute the plan he'd been developing for days. Hugo attacked Amber, overpowering her quickly. He bound her, gagged her, began implementing the torture techniques he'd researched online. The assault was both sexual and violent, designed to inflict maximum suffering before death. And Denise, Amber's own mother, participated, either actively assisting or standing by while her daughter was raped, tortured, and murdered. The psychological horror of a mother betraying her child in such an absolute way was almost impossible to process. After killing Amber, Hugo and Denise dismembered her body. They used tools to separate limbs from torso, to reduce a human being to manageable pieces that could fit in coolers. They dug a grave in their backyard. They buried their victim, covered the evidence, and continued their lives as though nothing had happened. For 8 days, they lived above Amber's remains, went about daily activities, all while police and families searched desperately. The trial also revealed additional victims. Hugo had sexually abused Amber's younger brother repeatedly, subjecting him to rape and corruption of a minor. Denise knew about this abuse and did nothing, making her complicit in these crimes as well. The full scope of depravity in that household was staggering: multiple victims, ongoing abuse, a complete breakdown of the basic human bonds that should exist between adults and children. On November 26, 2021, the judges delivered their verdict. Both Hugo Bustamante and Denise Llanos were found guilty. Hugo was convicted of qualified rape with femicide of Amber Cornejo, illegal burial, repeated rape of a minor, Amber's brother, and corruption of a minor. The sentence was absolute: presidio perpetuo calificado, qualified life imprisonment without possibility of parole for 40 years minimum. Denise Llanos was convicted as an accomplice to femicide, illegal burial, and repeated rape of a minor. She received 18 years in prison. The court determined she had actively participated in luring her daughter, was present during the torture and murder, helped dismember and bury the body, and failed to protect her son from sexual abuse. A mother who should have been Amber's protector became her executioner's assistant. Judge Manuel Muñoz Chamorro read the sentence aloud, his voice steady but the weight of the case evident in every word. The courtroom was packed with Amber's family, journalists, activists, and citizens demanding justice. When the verdict was announced, some wept. Others shouted approval. But nothing could bring Amber back. No sentence could undo what had been done to her. Justice, when it finally arrived, felt hollow, necessary but insufficient. Hugo's reaction to the verdict was characteristically cold. He showed no emotion, no remorse, no acknowledgement of the lives he'd destroyed. It was the same flatness he'd displayed during that 2006 interview with Carlos Pinto, the same emptiness that had allowed him to kill repeatedly without conscience. If he felt anything at all, he kept it buried deeper than the bodies he'd hidden. But Hugo Bustamante wasn't finished confessing. From his prison cell in maximum security, isolated from the general population for his own protection, Hugo began talking to authorities about his past. He mentioned Elena Hinojosa and Eduardo Paez, two people who disappeared in 1996, back before his first arrest. Hugo claimed responsibility for their deaths, providing details only the killer would know. Investigators reopened those cold cases, now transformed from missing persons to probable homicides. Hugo described killing Elena Hinojosa, disposing of her body, erasing her from existence. He spoke about Eduardo Paez with the same casual detachment, as though discussing characters in a movie rather than real people he'd murdered. Both cases had gone cold decades ago. Families had never received closure, and now Hugo was providing answers they'd stopped hoping for. The confessions raised a chilling question. How many others were there? Hugo had killed at least 5 people across 3 separate incidents spanning nearly 25 years. Veronica Vasquez and her son Eugenio in 2005. Elena Hinojosa and Eduardo Paez in 1996. Amber Cornejo in 2020. 5 confirmed victims, but serial killers rarely confess to everything. The earth around Villa Alemana might hold more secrets, more bodies buried and forgotten, more families denied the truth about their missing loved ones. Hugo's daughter from an earlier relationship spoke publicly about the shame and horror of being associated with him. "My father didn't deserve to be free," she told reporters, her voice breaking. "I carry his name, his blood, and every day I wake up with the knowledge that he's a monster. I think about Amber, about Veronica, about Eugenio, about all the people he hurt, and I wonder what I could have done, what anyone could have done to stop him." Her pain was valid and heartbreaking. Children don't choose their parents, and she bore no responsibility for Hugo's crimes. But society's failure to keep him imprisoned, that was on everyone. The judges who approved his parole, the lawmakers who created the flawed system, the bureaucrats who processed paperwork without questioning whether a man who couldn't promise not to kill again should walk free, all bore pieces of the responsibility for Amber's death. The case sparked nationwide debate about criminal justice reform. Chile's conditional liberty laws were scrutinized, criticized, and eventually modified. New provisions required psychological evaluations to carry more weight. Judges gained more discretion to deny parole based on assessments of future danger. The automatic nature of the previous system was dismantled, replaced with something that at least attempted to balance rehabilitation with public safety. But these reforms came too late for Amber, too late for Veronica and Eugenio, too late for Elena and Eduardo. The changes were written in blood, purchased with lives that should never have been lost. And even with reforms, fundamental questions remained. Can someone like Hugo Bustamante ever be rehabilitated? Should society take that risk? How do we balance mercy and justice, second chances and public safety? The feminist movement in Chile adopted Amber's case as a rallying cry. "Ni una menos," not one less, became a demand for systemic change to protect women and girls from violence. Vigils were held on every anniversary of Amber's death. Purple ribbons appeared throughout Villa Alemana. Her face on posters became a symbol of all the women murdered by men who should have been stopped, could have been stopped, but weren't. Amber's father, who lived in Antofagasta and had faithfully sent support money for his daughter every month, was destroyed by her murder. He had entrusted Denise with Amber's care, believing that despite their complicated relationship, a mother would protect her child. That trust was betrayed in the most complete and horrific way possible. He would never see his daughter graduate, never walk her down the aisle, never meet his grandchildren. All of it stolen by a monster the system set free and a mother who chose evil. Villa Alemana struggled with the trauma. This wasn't some distant crime in another city. This happened in their neighborhoods, on their streets. The house where Amber was murdered became infamous, avoided by neighbors who couldn't forget what had occurred there. The backyard where she was buried felt cursed, haunted by memories of what had been found beneath the earth. Some residents moved away, unable to live so close to such horror. In prison, Hugo Bustamante exists in isolation. He's segregated from the general population because inmates have their own justice system, and child killers occupy the lowest rung. Even hardened criminals view Hugo as beneath contempt. He spends his days in a cell, his nights on a thin mattress, his future stretching into decades of confinement. It's not enough. Nothing could be enough. But it's all society can do. Denise Llanos serves her 18-year sentence in a women's prison. Reports indicate she struggled to adjust, facing hostility from other inmates who know what she did. A mother who helped murder and sexually assault her own daughter finds few allies behind bars. She'll be eligible for release someday, assuming she survives her sentence. When that day comes, she'll step into a world that knows exactly who she is and what she's capable of. The question that haunts everyone connected to this case is simple and impossible. Why? Why did Hugo kill? Why did Denise betray her daughter? What possible reason could justify or explain such absolute evil? Psychologists might point to Hugo's traumatic childhood, his early exposure to drugs and violence, his development as a sociopath incapable of empathy. But plenty of people survive terrible childhoods without becoming serial killers. Some evil might be explainable, but that doesn't make it excusable. Hugo Bustamante made choices. He chose violence over peace, murder over mercy, depravity over decency. He had opportunities to change, to seek help, to stop before killing again. He had 11 years in prison after murdering Veronica and Eugenio to reflect, to develop remorse, to become someone different. Instead, he planned his next murder, researching torture techniques and waiting for the right victim. And what about Denise? How does a mother participate in murdering her own child? The psychological mechanisms that allowed this remain mysterious and disturbing. Perhaps she was under Hugo's control, manipulated and coerced. Perhaps she feared him and complied out of terror. Or perhaps she was simply evil herself, capable of the same callous violence that defined Hugo. The truth probably lies somewhere in that darkness, inaccessible to people who still possess functioning consciences. Amber Cornejo would be 21 years old now if she had lived. She'd be finishing university, maybe starting a career, falling in love, experiencing all the joys and pains of young adulthood. Instead, she's frozen at 16, forever the smiling girl in photographs. Forever the victim whose story warns us about systemic failures and human monsters. Her life was reduced to evidence in a criminal case, her body to remains in coolers, her future to nothing but absence. The legislative changes that followed Amber's death were codified as Amber's Law, legislation specifically designed to prevent conditional liberty for violent offenders deemed psychologically dangerous. It wasn't the memorial she deserved, but it was something. Other potential victims might be spared because Amber wasn't. Her death purchased safety for strangers she'd never meet. It's a terrible trade, one she never agreed to, but perhaps it gives her story meaning beyond just horror. Carlos Pinto, the journalist who interviewed Hugo in 2006, revisited the case after Amber's murder. He reviewed that old footage, watching Hugo casually admit he might kill again, and the prescience of the moment was chilling. I asked him a question, Pinto said in interviews. He answered honestly. We all heard it, but nobody stopped him. That honesty, Hugo's admission that he couldn't promise not to kill again, should have been a disqualifier for parole. It should have been evidence that he remained dangerous. Instead, it was ignored. The families of Hugo's victims formed a grim club nobody wants to join. They connected through shared trauma, through the knowledge that their loved ones died at the hands of the same man. Some found comfort in each other. Others preferred to grieve alone. But all of them carried the same questions. Could this have been prevented? Why wasn't he stopped? Who failed? And how do we ensure it never happens again? Villa Alemana will forever be marked by these crimes. The city where Hugo Bustamante was born also became the city where he buried bodies. 3 separate incidents, decades apart, all in the same small commune. The Tambor killer is Villa Alemana's most infamous resident, a stain on the city's history that won't wash away. Tourist guides don't mention him, but locals know. The houses where he killed have new occupants now, but the history remains, seeping into the walls like bloodstains. As this story concludes, Hugo Bustamante sits in a cell, alive while his victims are dust. He breathes, eats, sleeps, experiences sensations that Veronica, Eugenio, Elena, Eduardo, and Amber will never feel again. He exists and they don't. This fundamental injustice that the killer outlives the killed is one of the cruelest realities of murder. Time passes, but it changes nothing essential. Hugo remains what he's always been, a predator without conscience, a void where humanity should exist. The lesson of Hugo Bustamante, if lessons can be extracted from such darkness, is this: some people cannot be reformed. Some crimes are so heinous that second chances become dangerous delusions. When someone tells you who they are, when they admit on television they might kill again, believe them, and never, ever give them the opportunity to prove it. Amber Cornejo deserved better. She deserved a system that protected her. She deserved a mother who loved her. She deserved a life measured in decades, not days. She deserved justice before she needed it, prevention instead of punishment. But she got none of these things. What she got was a monster with a second chance and a tragic, brutal end. Tonight, we've examined the case of Hugo Bustamante Perez, the Tambor killer, the man who buried bodies in barrels, the predator the system set free. We've walked through decades of violence, traced patterns of killing, witnessed systemic failure in its most catastrophic form. The story is finished, but its implications echo forward. Every time a violent offender comes up for parole, someone somewhere should think of Amber. Every time the justice system prioritizes process over safety, someone should remember what happened in Villa Alemana. The dead can't speak for themselves, so we speak for them. We remember their names: Veronica Vasquez Puebla, Eugenio Honorado Vasquez, Elena Hinojosa, Eduardo Paz, and especially Amber Cornejo, 16 years old, buried in a backyard. Her life stolen by evil we could have stopped but didn't. Sleep well, Amber. You deserved so much more than this world gave you. Your story is told. Your name is remembered. And though justice came too late, it came. The monster who killed you will die in prison. His name synonymous with evil. His legacy nothing but horror and warning. You live on in the hearts of those who loved you, in the laws that bear your name, in every life saved by the reforms purchased with your blood. And to those listening, remember that monsters are real. They walk among us wearing human faces, sometimes even fooling the systems designed to contain them. Stay vigilant, protect the vulnerable, and never forget that justice delayed is often justice denied, that second chances can be death sentences, and that some evil, once recognized, must never be released again. This was the story of the Tambor killer. This was the tragedy of Amber Cornejo. This was a warning written in blood that we ignore at our peril. The hunt is over. The monster is caged, but the dead remain dead, and that truth will never change. Thank you for watching and being part of this dive into the dark and fascinating stories that keep us all on edge. If you enjoyed the ride, remember to like, subscribe, and share with others who crave a good mystery. Tell us where you're watching from. I love knowing where in the world our true crime family is tuning in. Your presence means a lot. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and keep digging into the shadows where truth and mystery meet.